I am glad you found your way here tonight. Settle in, pull the blanket up if you need to, and let the world outside go quiet for a while. There is no rush to any of this. What I want to tell you about is something so ordinary that most people never think twice about it, and yet for hundreds of years it was tangled up with fear, faith, and the fragile line between health and death. It touched kings and farmers alike, and it shaped daily life in ways that most history books never bother to mention. Tonight we are going to talk about something as simple and as complicated as washing. Because for the people who lived through the Middle Ages, staying clean was never just a matter of comfort. It was a quiet, constant negotiation with disease, with shame, with the watching eyes of neighbours who believed that dirt on the skin might mean something rotten in the soul, and that water itself, at certain points in history, might be the very thing that let death in through the pores. To be clean or not to be could shape whether a person was trusted, married, hired, or turned away at the church door. It could shape whether they survived a season of plague at all. Picture a small stone house on the edge of an English village sometime in the early 1300s. The night is still fully dark outside, though the birds have not yet started. Inside, a young woman named Agnes kneels by the hearth, coaxing the banked embers back into a low orange glow. She is perhaps 18, the daughter of a weaver, and this morning matters more than most. There is a market in town, and there is a young man who will be there, a tanner's son who has spoken to her twice now after church, both times, a little too carefully for it to mean nothing. Agnes fills a blackened iron pot with water, carried up from the well the evening before, and sets it near the fire to warm. Steam begins to curl off the surface almost at once, and the smell of wood smoke settles into her clothes the way it does every morning of her life. She works quietly so as not to wake her younger brothers who sleep on a pallet across the room tangled together for warmth. While she waits for the water to lose its chill, she unpins her hair and works a bone comb through it, slowly checking as she does most mornings for lice. It is not vanity that drives her. Lice are a fact of medieval life, clinging to hair and wool and bedding, no matter how careful a household is, and a comb like the one in her hand has been found by archaeologists in graves across Europe, worn smooth by hands exactly like hers. When the water is finally warm enough to bear, she washes her face, her neck, her hands and forearms with a scrap of linen cloth working in the firelight because there is no other light to work by. She rubs a little dried lavender into the linen, first crushed between her fingers because a clean smell matters almost as much as a clean body, and a lump of hard soap made from wood ash and rendered fat sits wrapped in cloth on the shelf above her, saved for special occasions rather than used every day. Then she dresses, ties her hair back under a plain linen cap, and steps outside into air, so cold it catches in her throat, carrying the now empty pot back toward the well before her brothers are even awake, her breath fogging in front of her in the last of the darkness. It is a small moment, a single young woman alone in the dark trying to feel presentable before a world that will judge her for far more than whether her hands are clean. If Agnes arrives at market with grime under her nails, or with a smell that lingers, it will not simply embarrass her. It might be read as a sign of poverty, of poor character, even of illness in a world where dirt and disease were often assumed to travel together. And yet in that same small moment lives an entire hidden history, one that most people today have never really been told the truth about a history, far stranger and far more human than the tired old image of a filthy, indifferent past. Because here is something that tends to surprise people. The popular idea of the Middle Ages as 1,000 years of unwashed, foul-smelling misery, where nobody bathed and everyone simply accepted a life caked in filth, is largely a myth built up centuries later by people who wanted the past to look primitive compared to their own age. For long stretches of the medieval period, bathing was not shunned at all. It was in many towns a genuine pleasure, and public bathhouses were as familiar a part of daily life as the local baker or the parish church offering steam hot tubs, herbal soaks, and even shared meals to anyone with a coin to spare. It's also worth knowing that this culture of bathing did not appear out of nowhere. It grew unevenly and imperfectly out of the ruins of an older world. The Roman Empire had built some of the most sophisticated bathing complexes ever constructed, with heated floors, plunge pools and elaborate plumbing, and although that empire collapsed centuries before Agnes was ever born, some of its habits and even some of its stone foundations quietly survived underneath the towns that rose in its place. By the time Agnes is a young woman, whole guilds of soap makers are operating in cities such as Marseille and along the coast of what is now Spain, producing hard, pale bars from olive oil and ash that are traded across the continent, a detail that rarely makes it into the popular imagination of the period. And yet the myth of the filthy Middle Ages did not come from nowhere either. Something did happen somewhere in the long arc of medieval history that pushed entire cities to close their bathhouses, to grow suspicious of warm water itself, and to trust linen and perfume over soap and a basin. Something convinced physicians, kings, and ordinary frightened families that the very act of soaking in hot water might be an invitation to death. What was it that turned an entire continent against the bath? And how did people who genuinely believed water could kill them still manage in their own quiet ways to stay as clean and as dignified as they possibly could, using nothing but linen, herbs, and patience, while the actual evidence left behind in bones, combs, and account books tells a story the old stereotypes never could? Those are some of the questions this story is going to sit with tonight. Before we go further into it, if this is the kind of history you enjoy, the kind that takes something ordinary and quietly shows you the fear and the tenderness hiding underneath it, it would mean a great deal if you took a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this kind of storytelling find its way to more people who might need something calm to listen to tonight. And if you have a moment, leave a comment and let me know where in the world you are listening from and what drew you to a story like this one. I always read them, and there is something quietly comforting about knowing who is out there in the dark with me, on their own ordinary night, listening to a story about ordinary lives from long ago. For now, let yourself settle in fully, let your shoulders drop, and let's go back to the very beginning. Agnes and her comb and her scrap of lavender-scented linen belonged to a much larger world, one shaped by rivers and wells, by class and climate, by the slow inheritance of habits passed down from empires that had already fallen by the time she was born. Everything she does in that dark kitchen, from the water she carries to the herbs she crushes to the soap she saves for special days, was decided long before she existed by forces far beyond one village and one hearth. Some of it came down from Rome, some of it came from the church, some of it came from fear itself, the kind that spreads through a population faster than any disease ever could. To understand why she washes the way she does in the order she does with the tools she has, we have to step back from her small stone house entirely and look at the wider world that built her morning for her long before she was ever alive to live it. We have to see the wells her water comes from and the rivers that ran through every medieval town carrying both life and far too often disease along with it. We have to see the class lines drawn around who gets to be clean and who does not, the fine wool and the borrowed comb, the lord's private tub and the shared village trough, and we have to follow the long, slow story of how an entire continent learned, unlearned and relearned what it meant to feel safe in your own skin, a story that begins as so many medieval stories do, with the quiet, stubborn habits people inherited from a world that had already vanished by the time they were born. Water does not arrive by turning a handle in this world. It has no pipe running quietly behind a wall, no tank sitting patiently overhead waiting to be called on. For Agnes, and for nearly everyone alive in medieval Europe, water is something you go out and get something, you carry something that costs a portion of your morning, and a good deal of your strength before it ever touches your skin. To understand what it meant to stay clean in this world, we first have to understand just how much labour clean water actually demanded long before anyone got near a bin or a bath. Most medieval settlements grow up around a water source rather than the other way around. A village sits where a spring rises reliably out of the ground, or where a river bends gently enough to be reached without danger, or where a well can be dug down to a water table that will not run dry in a hot summer. This is not a small detail. It shapes where people live, how far they travel each day, and how much of their labour is quietly absorbed by the simple act of keeping a household in water. In many villages, it falls to women and children to make the walk to the well or the riverbank sometimes twice a day, carrying wooden buckets or clay jars balanced on a yoke across the shoulders, the water sloshing and spilling with every uneven step on a muddy path. A single trip might yield only a few gallons, barely enough for cooking, drinking, and the barest wash of hands and face. Anything beyond that, a real bath, a full washing of hair and body, requires multiple trips, multiple hours, and a fire kept burning long enough to take the worst of the chill out of the water. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. Before a person could even begin to think about cleanliness, they first had to solve with their own two hands the basic problem of moving heavy water uphill. This is one of the quiet reasons that bathing in the full sense we might imagine today was never a daily habit for most people in the countryside. It was not laziness, and it was not indifference to dirt. It was arithmetic worked out in aching shoulders and hours that could otherwise go toward planting, weaving, or simply resting after a long day. A full bath in a wooden tub heated over an open fire could consume the better part of a day's fuel, and a household's entire water supply for that day, an expense a farming family could rarely justify, except on special occasions before a wedding, before a major church feast, or in preparation for childbirth. Washing the visible parts of the body, the face, the hands, the neck happened far more often, sometimes daily, because it required so much less. The line between what counted as clean and what counted as extravagant was drawn, quite literally, by how much water a person could afford to haul and heat, and that line moved constantly depending on the season, the harvest, and how much fuel remained stacked against the wall of the house. Towns and cities complicate this picture in interesting ways, and this is where something genuinely surprising enters the story. It would be easy to assume that crowding people together in a medieval town made access to water worse, and in some ways it did, but in other ways urban life in the period was surprisingly organised around solving exactly this problem. Many larger towns built systems of public conduits, pipes made of hollowed elm or lead that carried water from a distant spring into the heart of the settlement, feeding stone fountains, where residents could fill their own containers without walking all the way to the source. London had such a system by the 1300s, drawing water from springs outside the city walls into a public conduit in the middle of Cheapside, one of its busiest streets, so that ordinary residents could collect water within a short walk of home rather than trekking to the River Thames itself, whose water was often fouled by tanning workshops and slaughterhouses upstream. And here is the detail that tends to catch people off guard. Some of the most sophisticated water engineering in medieval Europe was not built by kings or merchants at all, but by monks. Monasteries with their large populations, their kitchens, their infirmaries, and their genuine religious commitment to hygiene as a form of discipline and care often built remarkably advanced plumbing systems centuries before most towns managed anything similar. At Canterbury in England, a detailed plan survives from the 12th century showing an entire network of pipes bringing fresh water into the monastery from a spring more than half a mile away, feeding a washing house, a kitchen, an infirmary, and even flushing latrines through a constant deliberate flow of water. This was not a rough sketch. It was a genuinely engineered system designed with real understanding of gravity, pressure, and distance. Built by men who believed that cleanliness of the body and cleanliness of the soul were not entirely separate concerns. That belief is worth pausing on because it complicates a picture many people carry of the medieval church as somehow opposed to bathing on principle. For long stretches of the period that simply was not true. Monastic rules in many orders specifically required regular washing, particularly before receiving communion, and some infirmaries kept private bathing rooms specifically for the sick and the elderly. The idea that the church uniformly condemned the body and everything associated with it belongs more to later stereotype than to the documented reality of daily monastic life. Scholars still debate exactly how widespread these more elaborate systems were outside of wealthy monasteries and a handful of major towns, since so much of ordinary rural life left no written record behind at all. But the physical evidence that does survive in stone conduits, lead pipe fragments, and monastic building plans paints a picture considerably more organized than the popular imagination usually allows. Class inevitably decides how much of any of this a person actually experiences. A wealthy household, whether noble or merchant, might have a private wooden tub brought into a bedchamber lined with linen sheets to protect bare skin from splinters and filled by servants who do the hauling and heating that a poorer family would have to do for themselves. Herbs and flower petals might be scattered across the surface of the water. Rose petals, chamomile, sweet flag, both for the pleasant scent and because certain plants were genuinely believed to carry medicinal virtue through the skin. A noble bath is as much a small ceremony as it is a practical act, sometimes attended by close family or even conducted while receiving guests, an intimacy that would seem strange by later standards, but was simply part of how privilege was displayed in this period. A peasant family, by contrast, is fortunate to manage a full-body wash a handful of times a year, relying instead on frequent washing of the hands and face, careful attention to lice and grooming and clean linen, worn close against the skin, since linen itself, as it turns out, plays a far larger role in medieval cleanliness than water ever does a thread of the story we will return to more fully as it becomes central to everything that follows. Climate shapes the picture as well in ways that are easy to overlook from a distance of many centuries. In the warmer regions around the Mediterranean in parts of Italy, southern France and Iberia rivers run gentler for more of the year. Bathing traditions inherited more directly from Roman and later Islamic influence remain culturally stronger for longer, and public bathhouses tend to be more numerous and more central to daily social life. Islamic Iberia in particular sustains an elaborate bathhouse culture directly descended from earlier Roman models, one that continues to influence bathing customs in neighbouring Christian kingdoms for centuries. Farther north in England, the Low Countries and much of what is now Germany, colder rivers, shorter growing seasons and a greater reliance on wood fires for basic survival make full bathing a rarer, more seasonal event, something reserved more naturally for the warmer months when water did not have to be fought for against the cold. None of this means that people in colder regions accepted filth as a normal condition of life the way later stereotypes would have us believe. It means they solved the problem of cleanliness differently, leaning more heavily on dry methods, on linen, on careful daily habits that required less water and less fuel, and on public facilities where they existed, rather than on the private water-heavy bathing that a warmer climate and a wealthier household could more easily support. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how these regional habits shifted decade by decade, since so much of it depends on scattered household accounts, monastic records, and the occasional surviving bathhouse ruin. But the broad pattern across the surviving sources is clear enough, and it is far more varied, far more resourceful than the flattened image of an entire continent simply choosing to live in dirt. What all of this begins to reveal is a world where cleanliness was never a fixed universal standard the way it might feel today when water arrives instantly and warmly at the turn of a tap. It was a negotiation constantly renewed between geography, labour, wealth, faith, and climate. A negotiation that every single person, from a monk copying manuscripts by candlelight to a farmer's daughter carrying water uphill before dawn, had to work out for themselves within the particular circumstances of their own life. And it was precisely because bathing required so much deliberate effort, so much organisation, so much investments of fuel and time and trust that when a culture finally did build something as ambitious as a true public bathhouse, open to nearly anyone with a coin, it became something far more significant than a simple convenience. It became one of the great social institutions of the medieval town, a place where the whole careful architecture of daily hygiene finally came together under one roof, and it is there into the steam and the noise and the surprising warmth of that world that the story turns next. Long before Agnes was ever born, before her village existed, before the church at its centre had even been built, an entire civilization on this same soil had already mastered the art of bathing on a scale that would not be matched again for well over 1,000 years. The Romans did not simply wash. They built temples to the act of washing, vast public complexes with heated floors, cold plunge pools, exercise yards, and rooms specifically designed to move a bather gradually from steam to warmth to a final bracing cold, all of it open to ordinary citizens for the price of a single small coin. Some of these Roman bathhouses could hold more than 1,000 people at once, and they were not simply places to get clean. They were where business was discussed, where gossip travelled, where a person might spend an entire afternoon among neighbours entirely wrapped in steam and conversation. Beneath the floors, an ingenious system called the hypercoursed circulated hot air from a furnace through a network of small brick pillars, warming the stone above so thoroughly that bathers could walk barefoot across it in the depths of winter. A piece of engineering so effective that its basic principle would not be widely reproduced in ordinary European buildings again until many centuries later. It is worth understanding this world clearly, because everything that follows in the story of medieval hygiene exists in direct relationship to its so uneven collapse. That collapse did not happen overnight, and it did not happen everywhere at once. As the Western Roman Empire fractured across the 5th century, the vast infrastructure that had made bathing on this scale possible began to fail in ways that were at first almost invisible to the people living through them. Aqueducts require constant maintenance, skilled engineers, and stable funding to keep water flowing across sometimes extraordinary distances, and as central authority weakened, that maintenance simply stopped happening in one region after another. A cracked channel here, a collapsed arch there, a workshop of trained engineers that quietly closed because nobody could pay them anymore. Within a few generations, in many areas, the specific technical knowledge required to build and repair these systems had faded from common practice entirely, not because anyone decided bathing was unimportant, but because the elaborate civilization capable of supporting it at that scale had simply come apart. Some cities, the great bathhouses, stood empty and silent for generations, their heated floors gone cold, their pools slowly filling with fallen leaves and rubble, monuments to an ambition that the world around them could no longer sustain, while in others, local rulers stripped the lead piping and the carved stone for reuse elsewhere, quietly dismantling what an earlier age had built to last forever. What replaced it across the long centuries that followed was smaller, more local, and built around whatever water source a community actually had, rather than water carried in from many miles away. And this is where something genuinely interesting happens. Something that the popular story of the fall of Rome tends to skip entirely. The habit of bathing itself never actually disappeared. It shrank, it adapted, and eventually it grew back into something new. By the time towns across medieval Europe begin to prosper again roughly from the 11th century onward, a new institution starts appearing in city after city, one that borrows something from the old Roman model without ever fully replicating its scale. These are the public bathhouses that people at the time called stews, a word that originally simply meant a heated room filled with steam before it came to describe the entire building. A typical stew is a modest structure compared to a Roman thermae, often built around a single large room or a small cluster of rooms heated by a fire beneath the floor or behind a wall, with wooden tubs large enough for 2 or 3 people to share filled with water, kept hot by regular additions from a cauldron kept simmering nearby. Picture stepping into one on a cold afternoon in a prosperous market town. The air inside hits you first thick with steam and the smell of wood smoke and crushed herbs, since bath keepers often scattered rosemary, mint or chamomile into the water, both for the scent and for their believed medicinal properties. Voices carry oddly in the warm damp air, softened and close. Men and women bathe on different days or in separate rooms depending on the town and its particular customs. Though the strict separation people often assume was universal was in reality inconsistently enforced, and some establishments allowed mixed bathing quite openly, a detail that later reformers would use against the institution entirely. Attendants moved between the tubs offering cups of wine or ale, since a visit to the stews was as much a social occasion as a hygienic one, sometimes lasting an entire afternoon. Wooden benches line the walls for those waiting their turn, and in the largest establishments, a second room might offer dry heat alone, a true sweating chamber where bathers sit wrapped in linen sheets until moisture beads on every surface, a practice that echoes whether directly inherited or independently rediscovered sweating rooms once found in the grandest Roman complexes centuries before. Here is a detail that tends to surprise people the most. The person running your bath and tending the fire is very often the same person who would pull an aching tooth, let blood from your arm with a small blade, or set a broken bone. Barbers in the medieval period were not simply groomers of hair and beards. They were in most towns the closest thing to a surgeon that an ordinary person could access, and the bathhouse was frequently where this work actually happened, since it already had hot water, clean linen, and a controlled warm environment. The connection between barbering, bathing, and minor surgery was official enough in many places that barber guilds and bathhouse keepers operated under closely related charters, and the striped pole still associated with barbershops today, red for blood and white for bandages, traces its origin directly back to this overlapping medieval trade. Trade and conquest carried influence into this world as well in ways that scholars are still working to fully untangle. Contact with the Islamic world through Iberia, through Sicily, and through the long, complicated relationships built during the crusading centuries brought European visitors into direct contact with the hammam tradition, an elaborate bathing culture that had itself grown out of the same late Roman inheritance, but had been preserved, refined, and expanded far more consistently across the Islamic world than it had been in most of Christian Europe. Returning crusaders, merchants, and pilgrims carried back descriptions and sometimes direct experience of these more elaborate steam-bathing traditions, and many historians see this contact as one real thread feeding into the growing popularity of stews in European towns during the 12th and 13th centuries, alongside older, more locally rooted habits that had never fully disappeared. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how much direct influence travelled, which direction, and through which specific routes, since so much of this cultural exchange left no formal written record, but the broad pattern of contact and mutual awareness between these bathing traditions is well established in the surviving sources. Towns took the business of bathing seriously enough to regulate it formally. In London, the bathhouses clustered along the south bank of the River Thames in an area called Southwark, operated for centuries under licenses that were in one of the odder details of medieval civic life, ultimately controlled by the Bishop of Winchester, whose diocese held authority over that stretch of riverbank. Rules governed prices, operating hours, and the conduct expected of both keepers and customers, evidence that this was viewed by civic and church authorities alike as a legitimate, valuable trade worth carefully organising, rather than something shameful to be hidden at the edge of town. Similar municipal ordinances survive from cities across France and the German territories, listing fixed prices for a simple wash, a full bath, or a session in the sweating room, along with fines for bath keepers who let the water grow too cold or too dirty before changing it. In Paris, official inspectors known as criers were tasked with walking the streets each morning, announcing which bathhouses had fresh hot water ready, a small civic detail that reveals just how normal, how woven into the daily rhythm of urban life the whole institution had become by this point. And yet even in this period of genuine growth and civic acceptance, a quieter tension was already beginning to gather beneath the surface. Because bathhouses offered warm private rooms, and because the strict separation of men and women was not always maintained, some stews did over time develop a secondary reputation that had nothing to do with hygiene at all, drifting toward other forms of business that church authorities and town councils viewed with increasing unease. This did not happen everywhere, and it did not happen all at once, and most bathhouses throughout most of the medieval period continued to function exactly as they were meant to, as places of washing, healing, and ordinary social life. But this quieter thread of moral suspicion present even during the institution's most successful years would eventually tangle together with far larger and far more frightening fears that had nothing to do with reputation and everything to do with survival itself, fears that were still for now generations away from arriving, for now in the world. Agnes and her neighbours are building their lives inside the stew is simply part of the landscape of the town, as familiar and as unremarkable as the mill or the market cross. A tired traveller stops there before finding an inn for the night. A mother brings a sick child for a warm soak believed to ease a fever. A group of tradesmen gather there after a long week trading news over cups of watered wine while steam curls around them. An elderly widow, whose joints ache more with each passing winter, is helped in by an attendant who has known her for 20 years and asks after her health without being asked to. It is in these decades one of the great quiet achievements of medieval town life, rebuilt slowly and imperfectly from the ashes of a much older empire, and carried forward by ordinary people who wanted, as people always have, simply to feel clean, cared for, and briefly at ease in the company of others. What none of them yet know, moving through the warm steam of an ordinary afternoon content and unhurried, is just how high this culture of bathing is about to rise into royal courts and grand civic celebrations, or how completely and how suddenly in the space of a single terrifying generation it will all be called into question. There is a particular kind of ceremony that tells you everything about how seriously a society takes an idea, and by the height of the medieval period bathing had earned exactly that kind of ceremony. Before a young nobleman could be knighted, before he could kneel and rise again with a sword resting on his shoulder, he was expected in many parts of medieval Europe to be ritually bathed the night before, dressed afterward in fresh white robes, and kept in quiet vigil through the night as a symbol of spiritual purification before the honour to come. This tradition became so central to English chivalric practice that it eventually gave its name to an entire honour still awarded by the British monarchy today, known as the Order of the Bath, a title that sounds almost comical to modern ears until you understand just how much weight, how much genuine solemnity medieval society once placed on the act of washing before a sacred moment. The water itself was not simply warm water in these ceremonies. It was treated as a kind of threshold, a passage a young man walked through on his way from one identity into another, no less symbolically important than the sword, the spurs, or the formal oath that would follow the next morning. This is the world. The story now enters a period stretching roughly from the 12th through the 14th century, when bathing in much of Europe was not merely tolerated or practically necessary, but genuinely celebrated, woven into royal ceremony, medical practice, and the ordinary rhythms of prosperous town life all at once. It is worth sitting with this fully because it stands in such direct contrast to the image most people carry of the era, and understanding just how high this culture rose makes what comes later in the storyline with far more weight than it otherwise would. Royal courts in particular treated bathing as both a genuine pleasure and a display of status. Surviving household accounts from the English crown kept with the meticulous record keeping. Medieval royal administrations were known for show that King John, who ruled England in the early 1200s, employed a personal attendant whose specific job was managing the king's baths as the royal court travelled from castle to castle, a role significant enough to appear by name in official financial records. The king did not simply tolerate an occasional wash, he expected hot water proper vessels and a trained attendant to be available wherever he happened to be staying. A level of consistent personal hygiene that required real logistical planning in a world without running water, since a royal household on progress might move between a dozen different properties in a single season, and every single one of them had to be prepared in advance to receive both the king's court and the king's bath. Wealthy households further down the social ladder followed similar smaller versions of this same expectation with portable wooden tubs that could be carried between rooms or even between properties lined with linen, and sometimes canopied with cloth to keep drafts away from bare wet skin. A particularly grand version of this canopy, recorded in the accounts of at least one 14th century noble household, was embroidered with small silver stars, a small almost whimsical detail that survives only because a careful clerk once wrote it down in a list of household expenses, never imagining that anyone 6 centuries later would find it worth mentioning at all. Medicine too had fully absorbed the bath into its understanding of the human body. Medieval physicians largely worked from a framework inherited from ancient Greek and Roman thought, the theory of the 4 humours, which held that health depended on a careful balance between blood phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. Each humour associated with particular qualities of heat, cold, wetness and dryness. Bathing within this framework was not simply pleasant, it was a genuine medical tool, capable of warming a body that had grown too cold and damp or cooling one that had grown too hot and dry, and physicians prescribed specific bathing routines, specific water temperatures, and even specific herbs added to the water in much the same deliberate way a modern doctor might prescribe a course of medication. Illustrated medical manuscripts from the period, some of the most famous, copied and recopied across noble households for generations, include detailed guidance on which months of the year were best for bathing, which herbs suited which ailments, and which types of people based on their presumed humoral temperament should bathe more or less frequently than others. A person judged to have a naturally cold and moist temperament, for instance, might be advised to avoid long soaks in cool water altogether, favouring instead short warm baths scented with drying herbs such as sage, while a person judged hot and dry by nature might be encouraged toward gentle, cooler water and softer, more soothing herbs such as violet or rose. And here is a detail that tends to genuinely surprise people who assume medieval medicine was pure superstition with no practical value at all. Some of these prescribed bathing practices align remarkably well with what we understand about hygiene and circulation today, even though the underlying theory behind them was by modern scientific standards entirely wrong. A physician recommending warm water and gentle herbs to soothe an inflamed joint was arriving at a genuinely useful practice through a completely different humour-based line of reasoning than a modern doctor would use, yet the practical outcome, real relief for a real patient, was often surprisingly similar. Historians and medical historians alike still debate how much of this apparent overlap reflects genuine accumulated practical wisdom passed down through generations of trial and observation, And how much is simply coincidence dressed up afterward in more flattering modern language, since the medieval physicians themselves left detailed records of their theories but far less detail about how carefully those theories were actually tested against outcomes. Beyond the royal court and the physician's chamber, bathing reached its most genuinely festive expression in the bathhouses of prosperous towns, where the atmosphere during this period could resemble something closer to a lively social gathering than a simple hygienic errand. Illuminated manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries preserve vivid images of these scenes, men and women seated together in large communal tubs, sometimes several to a single vessel, sharing food from small tables set directly beside the water, musicians playing in the corner of the room, and in some of the more elaborate depictions couples clearly enjoying an evening of company as much as an evening of cleanliness. Some of the wealthiest bathhouses in cities such as Paris and Basel offered private rooms for those willing to pay more, along with meals that could stretch across several courses, transforming what began as an act of hygiene into something closer to a full evening of entertainment, not entirely unlike dining out at a fine establishment today, though, built instead around steam-warm water and the particular intimacy that shared bathing created. Wedding celebrations in particular sometimes included a formal bath as part of the festivities with the bride, and her attendants sharing a scented tub the morning of the ceremony, while musicians played outside the door, a custom recorded in household accounts from several wealthy merchant families across Flanders and northern France. Beyond the towns entirely, another form of bathing culture was flourishing across Europe during these same centuries, one built not around heated tubs and wood fires, but around the natural mineral springs that bubble up from the earth in certain fortunate locations. The English city that still carries the name Bath grew up directly around one such spring, a site the Romans had already recognized centuries earlier, and built an elaborate temple and bathing complex upon, dedicated to a goddess whose worship blended local British tradition with imported Roman religion. Long after Roman rule had ended, and the original complex had fallen into disrepair, medieval visitors continued to seek out the same warm mineral-rich waters, believing them capable of easing everything from joint pain to skin ailments to general weakness. And by the height of the medieval period, similar mineral spring towns across the continent in what is now Belgium, Germany and elsewhere had developed their own smaller but genuine traditions of medicinal travel, of people making real journeys, sometimes over considerable distance, specifically to soak in waters believed to carry a particular healing property found nowhere else. Pilgrims making their way toward a major religious shrines would sometimes plan their route to pass near a known healing spring, folding the physical relief of a warm mineral soak into the same journey undertaken for spiritual reasons, a blending of body and soul that felt entirely natural to people who rarely drew as sharp a line between the two as later centuries would. What made these medicinal springs so trusted when so much of medieval medicine relied on theory rather than direct observation? Perhaps it was simply that relief people genuinely felt after soaking in warm mineral water, aching joints, easing tired muscles, loosening was real and repeatable enough that no elaborate theory was needed to convince anyone of its value. The evidence remains genuinely limited on exactly how these local reputations first formed and spread from town to town in an age before anything resembling formal publication existed, but the sheer consistency of these traditions across such a wide stretch of geography and so many separate centuries suggests something more than mere coincidence or fashion. Modern hydrogeologists examining some of these same springs today have confirmed that several do carry genuinely elevated concentrations of minerals, or such as sulfur and calcium compounds, that can produce real measurable effects on skin and joint inflammation. A small but satisfying case where medieval intuition and modern chemistry appear to have arrived by entirely different paths at roughly the same conclusion. By this point in the story, cleanliness in much of medieval Europe had become something closer to a shared cultural value than a private necessity expressed through royal ceremony, formal medicine, civic regulation, and genuine unhurried pleasure all at once. A person moving through this world, whether a knight kept in vigil the night before his ceremony, a physician carefully measuring herbs into a patient's bathwater, or a merchant's family sharing an evening meal in a warm communal tub, existed inside a culture that had in its own particular way made real peace with water after centuries of slow rebuilding. Following the fall of an older civilization that had once done the very same thing on a grander scale, it is easy, looking back from a much later age that would come to see the medieval period as backward and unwashed, to forget just how confident, how genuinely sophisticated this culture of cleanliness had actually become by its height. And yet, if you have been listening carefully across these last several parts, you may have already noticed a few small threads left loose along the way, a lingering unease about mixed bathing that some reformers found troubling, a moral suspicion attached to certain establishments that never quite disappeared, even during the institution's most celebrated years. Is it possible for a culture to feel entirely secure in a habit, while a quiet doubt about that very habit continues gathering, almost unnoticed in the background the whole time? Those threads have not gone anywhere. They have simply been waiting quietly beneath the surface of this warm and confident world for the particular set of circumstances that would finally pull them forward and turn a culture that trusted water completely into one that would soon come to fear it more than almost anything else. Cracks rarely announce themselves. They appear first as small, almost forgettable details. A sermon here, a closed street there, a line in a physician's textbook that nobody at the time thought especially urgent, and only much later looking backward. Does anyone notice how many of those small details were quietly pointing toward the same coming storm? That is where the story turns now into the years when the bright, confident bathing culture of the previous generation begins, almost imperceptibly, to gather doubt. No single person alive during these decades could have named what was happening, because nothing dramatic enough had happened yet to name. It simply felt to most people going about their ordinary lives like a handful of unrelated inconveniences. A smellier river this year, a stricter sermon last winter, a leaner harvest than anyone would have liked. Some of the earliest fractures come from an unexpected direction, entirely the growing size of the towns themselves. Success in this case carries its own quiet cost. As cities such as London, Paris, and the great trading centres of Flanders swell in population across the 12th and 13th centuries, the rivers that once seemed generous enough to serve every need begin to strain under the weight of so many people living so closely together. A river that easily absorbed the waste of a modest town of a few thousand residents struggles considerably more when that same town has grown tenfold, its banks now lined with tanneries, dye works, and slaughterhouses, all of them discharging directly into the same water that households still draw from downstream. London's river fleet, once clean enough to support a busy fishing trade, had grown so fouled by waste and industrial runoff by the 1300s that royal officials issued repeated orders restricting what could be dumped into it, orders that were, if the surviving complaints are any indication, only partially obeyed. One petition submitted to the Crown by frustrated residents living near the river complained bitterly of the stench rising from the water. On warm days strong enough, the petitioners claimed, to be smelled from a considerable distance and to spoil the taste of ale brewed with water drawn nearby, a small, oddly specific detail that survives only because someone once felt strongly enough about their ale to put it in writing to the king. Water, the very substance the entire bathing culture depended on, was quietly becoming less trustworthy in exactly the places where the most people needed it. This matters more than it might first appear, because it begins to shift something subtle in how people relate to water itself. For generations, water had been treated broadly as a source of relief and cleansing. Now, in the crowded industrial corners of the largest towns, a person could watch with their own eyes as water carried filth rather than removed it. And that lived experience, repeated often enough across enough households, begins to plant a seed of genuine caution that no amount of nostalgia for the old bathhouse culture can fully erase. At the same time, a very different kind of fracture is opening within the world of formal medicine, one built not from lived experience in the streets, but from careful scholarly reasoning inside the great medical schools of the period, particularly at Salerno in southern Italy, and later at Montpellier in southern France, two of the most respected centres of medical learning in all of Europe. Physicians trained in these schools worked from the writings of the ancient physician Galen, whose theories on the human body had shaped Western medicine for over 1,000 years, and within Galen's framework sat an idea that would eventually prove enormously consequential: heat and moisture. Galen taught caused the pores of the skin to open, allowing substances to pass more freely between the outside air and the interior of the body. For most of the medieval period, this idea had simply supported the case for medicinal bathing, warm water opening the pores to allow beneficial herbal treatments to penetrate the skin more effectively. But the very same mechanism physicians increasingly began to reason could presumably work in reverse. If warmth and moisture opened the pores to let good things in, could they not just as easily let dangerous things in as well? Particularly something as feared and poorly understood as corrupted, unhealthy air, the kind believed at the time to rise from stagnant water, decaying matter, and poorly drained ground, and to carry sickness with it wherever the wind happened to blow. Medical writers of the period devoted considerable attention to describing exactly which conditions produced this so-called corrupted air, associating it particularly with marshland, with crowded, poorly ventilated streets, and with the very rivers that towns increasingly relied upon and increasingly polluted. A physician reasoning carefully through Galen's framework, watching a river grow fouler by the year, and hearing reports of corrupted air rising from stagnant water nearby, could arrive at a genuinely coherent, internally logical conclusion that a warm bath taken too near a source of bad air might do the body real harm rather than the good it had always been assumed to provide. It is a chain of reasoning built entirely from careful, sincere observation and inherited theory, containing not one deliberately malicious or careless step, and yet it would eventually help build the case for abandoning an entire beloved institution. This question, largely theoretical and academic in these early decades, circulated mostly among physicians and scholars, rather than ordinary bathers who continued visiting their local stews without a second thought. Scholars still debate exactly how quickly this more cautious interpretation of poor theory spread beyond university medical circles into everyday popular belief, since the surviving evidence consists mostly of formal medical texts written in Latin for other physicians rather than anything resembling public health advice aimed at ordinary townspeople. What is clear is that the theoretical groundwork, the specific idea that a warm, open pore was a vulnerable pore, was already fully assembled and circulating among educated people well before any single dramatic event would eventually force it into everyday conversation. A second, quieter fracture runs alongside this medical one, and it concerns fear of a very different, more visible disease. Leprosy, a chronic illness that produces disfiguring skin lesions and was in medieval Europe both greatly feared and poorly understood, had already shaped an entire parallel infrastructure of exclusion by this period, with dedicated leper houses called leprosaria, built on the outskirts of most major towns to house and separate the afflicted from the wider community. By some estimates drawn from surviving charitable records, several thousand of these institutions existed across Europe at the height of their number, a scale that suggests just how widespread the fear and perhaps the disease itself had genuinely become. The visible corruption of the skin associated with leprosy carried enormous symbolic weight in a culture already inclined to read the surface of the body as a window into the state of the soul beneath it. And this deep-seated cultural association between visible skin trouble and hidden spiritual or physical corruption had been quietly accumulating for generations. It did not on its own turn people against the bathhouse, but it deepened a particular kind of vigilance around the body, the skin, and what might be passing silently between one person and another in close shared physical spaces. A vigilance that would prove far more consequential once a genuinely new and far more terrifying threat eventually arrived. It is worth noting too that modern researchers examining medieval skeletal remains have found that leprosy diagnoses recorded in period documents did not always match the specific bone changes the disease is known to cause, suggesting that the medieval category of leprosy likely captured a range of different skin conditions under one deeply feared name, a reminder of how much diagnostic uncertainty shaped the fears people carried even when those fears felt entirely certain to the people living through them. Meanwhile, the quieter moral suspicion that had shadowed the bathhouses even during their most celebrated years was hardening into something more organized. Preachers in several towns began delivering sermons specifically warning against the moral dangers of mixed bathing, and a handful of church councils working at the local rather than the universal level issued formal statements discouraging clergy in particular from visiting public bathhouses at all, concerned less about hygiene than about the intimate, relaxed social atmosphere the stews had always been known for. These warnings were neither universal nor especially forceful in these early decades, and most ordinary parishioners appear to have continued visiting their local bathhouse without any real sense of moral conflict. But the language being used by religious authorities was noticeably shifting, growing less neutral and more suspicious with each passing decade, laying rhetorical groundwork that would later prove useful when a far more urgent set of fears needed somewhere to attach themselves. A travelling friar's surviving sermon, notes from this period preserved among a larger collection of preaching material intended to guide other clergy, specifically instruct fellow preachers to remind their congregations that cleanliness of the body means little without a corresponding cleanliness of conscience, a formulation that on its own sounds almost gentle, but that carried within it a subtle suggestion that too much attention paid to the body's comfort might come at some quiet spiritual cost. There is also the matter of a great famine that struck across much of northern Europe in the early 1300s, several decades before the story's central crisis, a catastrophic run of failed harvests brought on by years of unusually cold, wet weather that left entire regions malnourished, weakened, and considerably more vulnerable to disease than they had been in living memory. Chroniclers writing at the time describe scenes of genuine desperation, grain prices climbing far beyond what ordinary families could afford, livestock dying in flooded fields before they could be brought to slaughter, and in the very worst affected regions reports impossible to verify with full certainty but recorded by more than one contemporary writer of families driven to almost unthinkable extremes by sustained grinding hunger. This period of sustained hardship did not target bathing culture directly, but it strained the same civic and household resources, fuel, food, spare income that had long supported the leisurely, well-fed atmosphere of a proper bathhouse visit. A population fighting simply to keep itself fed has understandably less capacity for the unhurried social ritual that bathing had become at its height, and in towns hit hardest by the famine, several bathhouses appear in surviving records to have closed their doors for extended periods, not from any moral objection at all, but from the far simpler, far older problem of not enough fuel, not enough customers, and not enough spare coin to keep the fires burning. The famine passed eventually, as famines do, and many of these bathhouses reopened once harvests recovered, but the population that walked back through their doors was in a very real sense a weaker, more depleted population than the one that had walked out its collective resistance to whatever might come next already quietly diminished. None of these threads taken individually would have been enough to unravel a culture as deeply established as medieval bathing had become. A polluted river here, an academic theory circulating quietly among physicians there, a cautious sermon, a hard winter. Taken together, though they form something closer to dry kindling, laid carefully if unintentionally across an entire continent, waiting only for a single spark large enough to set it fully alight. What one has to wonder, would it actually take to turn a society that had spent centuries rebuilding its trust in water into one that would come to fear it more urgently than almost anything else? It would take something the scale of a famine and the speed of a rumour combined, something that could travel faster than any sermon, strike more indiscriminately than any polluted river, and leave behind a fear so total that even the most respected physicians in Europe would scramble to explain it using every tool their training had ever given them. That spark, when it finally arrives, will not come from a sermon or a polluted river or a difficult harvest. It will come from something far larger, far faster, and far more frightening than anything the people of this world have yet had to face, a catastrophe that will move through Europe with a speed and a totality that none of the fractures gathering quietly across these last several decades could have possibly prepared anyone for. The physicians debating poor theory in their quiet university chambers, the preachers cautioning their congregations about the stews, the families slowly recovering from years of hunger. None of them yet have any real sense of what is coming or how completely it will rewrite everything. This story has told you so far about water, about trust, and about what it truly means to feel safe inside your own skin. In October of 1347, a small fleet of Genoese trading ships put in at the Sicilian port of Messina, their crews largely dead or dying, their bodies marked with the swollen, blackened lumps that would soon give an entire catastrophe its name. Harbour officials, alarmed by what they saw, tried to turn the ships away, ordering them back out to open water before the sickness could spread any further onto Sicilian soil. It was already too late. Within days, the sickness had moved from the harbour into the town itself, carried, though nobody understood this at the time, by the rats and fleas that had travelled alongside the sailors in the ship's holds, creatures that slipped ashore long before anyone thought to question their presence. Within months it had moved from Sicily into mainland Italy, and from there along the dense, well-travelled network of trade routes that connected every major city in Europe. It began spreading north and west with a speed that nothing in living memory had prepared anyone to expect. This is the event that the fractures of the previous decades, the polluted rivers, the cautious sermons, the theoretical worries among physicians about corrupted air and open pores, had all been quietly, unknowingly building toward. This is the turning point. It is difficult even now to fully convey the scale of what happened across the years that followed. Modern historians estimate that somewhere between a third and half of the entire population of Europe died within roughly 4 years, a proportion of loss that has no real equivalent in the modern experience of most people listening to this story tonight. Entire villages were emptied so completely that their names simply vanished from later records. The fields around them left to grow wild because there was no one left to work them. In the largest cities, the dying arrived faster than the living could bury them, and municipal authorities in places such as Florence and Avignon were forced to dig vast common pits outside the city walls, a practical, desperate response to a crisis that had overwhelmed every ordinary structure meant to handle death with dignity. Contemporary chroniclers, writing in the middle of the catastrophe rather than looking back on it from any safe distance, describe streets where entire households died together within days of one another, where the customary rituals of mourning, the funeral processions, The tolling bells, the gathered neighbours simply became impossible to sustain at the scale the crisis demanded, and where in some of the hardest hit towns, the bells themselves eventually fell silent because there was no longer anyone left with the strength or the will to ring them for every single death. Faced with a catastrophe this total, this incomprehensible, the physicians of Europe did exactly what their training had taught them to do. They reached for the theoretical framework they trusted most, the very framework built from Galen's teaching on the humours and the pores that had been quietly developing for decades before the plague ever arrived. In the autumn of 1348, King Philip VI of France commissioned the medical faculty of the University of Paris, then among the most respected medical authorities in all of Europe, to produce a formal report explaining the plague and offering guidance on how to survive it. Their conclusion, delivered with the full confidence of the era's best available science, attributed the root cause to a rare and ominous alignment of the planets Saturn, Jupiter and Mars, an alignment believed to have corrupted the very air itself on a scale never before seen. The report went into considerable astronomical detail, tracing the specific timing of the alignment back several years and connecting it through a chain of reasoning that felt entirely rigorous to the scholars who produced it, to the corruption of the atmosphere across the whole of the known world. Whatever one makes of the astrology involved, the practical advice that followed from this diagnosis was entirely consistent with the poor theory that had already been circulating among physicians for years. Avoid bathhouses, avoid excessive heat, avoid anything that might open the pores of the skin and allow the corrupted, deadly air to enter the body more easily. Some physicians went further, still recommending that people avoid excessive exercise, strong emotion, and even certain foods believed to generate excess heat within the body, since anything that raised the body's internal warmth was now understood within this framework to raise the risk of infection along with it. This single, widely circulated piece of medical advice did more to end the great age of the medieval bathhouse than a century of moral suspicion and church sermons had managed on their own. Town councils across France, the German territories, and eventually much of the rest of Europe began ordering public bathhouses closed, sometimes temporarily, sometimes for good acting on guidance that felt to everyone involved like the most responsible, most scientifically sound decision available to them. Municipal records from several cities show councils debating the question with genuine seriousness, weighing the loss of tax revenue and civic pride that closure represented against the fear of contributing, even unknowingly, to further death, a balance that most towns faced with mounting bodies and mounting panic ultimately resolved in favour of caution. It is worth pausing on that. The people making these decisions were not being careless or superstitious in any way that felt careless or superstitious to them. They were following the best medical reasoning their civilization possessed, applying it as faithfully and as urgently as any modern public health official would apply the best available guidance during a genuine emergency. The tragedy is not that they acted foolishly. The tragedy is that the framework itself, however carefully reasoned, was simply wrong about the actual mechanism of the disease killing them. Because the plague, as we now understand it through centuries of subsequent medical research, was almost certainly spread primarily by fleas carried on black rats, creatures that travelled easily along the same trade routes and lived comfortably within the crowded granaries. Warehouses and homes of medieval towns, with a secondary, more direct form of transmission likely occurring between people once the disease progressed to its pneumonic form, spread through coughing rather than water, or open pores at all. Warm bathwater had nothing whatsoever to do with the actual spread of the disease, but nobody living through the crisis had any way of knowing that since the very concept of a bacterium of an organism too small to see with the naked eye simply did not exist yet as a scientific idea, and would not exist for another 5 centuries until the development of the microscope and later, germ theory finally gave physicians the tools to see what had actually been moving invisibly through their towns all along. Scholars still debate exactly how quickly ordinary people, as opposed to trained physicians, absorbed this new caution around bathing, since panic during a mass mortality event. This severe does not spread through formal channels alone, but through fear, rumor, and the simple desperate human instinct to avoid anything that might plausibly be connected to death, however thin that connection actually was. What we can say with more confidence, drawing on surviving municipal records and a merchant correspondence from across the affected regions, is that within a remarkably short span of years, avoidance of the bathhouse had become a widely shared, broadly understood precaution across much of educated and civic society, regardless of how uneven its adoption may have been among the wider population. Here is a detail that surprises many people who assume the closure of the bathhouses happened everywhere all at once in a single sweeping decision. It did not. The response varied enormously from region to region and from decade to decade, shaped as much by local politics and economics as by medical theory. Some cities, particularly in parts of Germany and the Low Countries, continued operating public bathhouses. Well into the following century, their communities apparently less persuaded, or perhaps simply less able to afford the loss of a valuable civic institution than their counterparts elsewhere. A handful of German towns even continued licensing new bathhouses for several generations after the first great wave of plague had passed, suggesting that the connection between bathing and disease, however dominant it eventually became across much of Europe, was never quite as universal or as immediately accepted as the popular memory of this period tends to assume. Other towns reopened their bathhouses fairly quickly once the worst of the initial outbreak passed, only to close them again during subsequent waves of plague, since the disease devastatingly did not simply arrive once and depart. It returned repeatedly across the following decades in slightly different forms and with somewhat different intensity, keeping the fear and the medical caution surrounding bathing alive and renewed for generation after generation, rather than allowing it to fade as the single traumatic memory might have. A person born a full generation after the first outbreak might reasonably have grown up believing the plague was simply a recurring permanent feature of the world, something that returned every decade or so the way a hard winter might, rather than the singular historic catastrophe it appears as, when compressed into a single paragraph of narration many centuries later. The emotional weight of living through repeated waves of a disease, this devastating, is almost impossible to overstate, and it reshaped far more than medical opinion about bathing. Religious responses ranged widely from renewed devotion and charitable giving to more extreme movements such as the flagellants groups who travelled from town to town performing public acts of penance in the belief that the plague represented divine punishment for humanity's sins, a response that speaks to just how desperately people searched for any explanation, any sense of order they could impose on a catastrophe that otherwise felt entirely beyond comprehension or control. These processions, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, drew enormous crowds wherever they passed, and church authorities grew increasingly uneasy about the movement as it spread, worried both by its unauthorized, independent character and by the scapegoating and violence that occasionally accompanied it in certain regions, a darker undercurrent to an already devastated continent that most surviving accounts describe only in passing, more concerned with recording the plague itself than with dwelling on every consequence that followed in its wake. Trust itself in institutions, in neighbours, in the basic predictability of daily life, took a blow from which entire communities would need generations to recover, and the bathhouse, once a symbol of civic pride and shared pleasure, became entangled in the middle of that broader collapse of trust, guilty by association with an era of loss too immense for anyone to fully process. What replaced the warm communal ritual of the stew, once so central to town life, was not in these early years any single clear alternative. It was instead a kind of cautious, improvised uncertainty, households falling back on whatever methods of cleanliness felt safest given the terrifying new medical consensus. A wary, fearful relationship with water that would, over the following generations, harden into habits and assumptions that would shape daily life across Europe for the next several centuries. Should a person avoid water entirely given what the physicians of Paris had concluded? Could a person still wash their hands and face without inviting the same danger associated with a full heated bath? These were not abstract questions for the people living through this. They were daily practical decisions made under real fear, by ordinary families simply trying to survive a world that had in the span of a few terrifying years become almost unrecognizable. A mother deciding whether to bathe a feverish child, a merchant wondering whether to visit the one bathhouse still operating in his town, a young widow uncertain whether the modest wash she had always known was still considered safe by the physicians whose judgment the whole of educated society now deferred to. All of them were navigating a genuinely new kind of daily anxiety that their parents and grandparents had simply never had to consider. It is this uncertain, transitional world shaped by grief by genuinely reasoned, but ultimately mistaken medical theory, and by a fear so pervasive it touched nearly every household in Europe that the story now has to sit inside for a while, because it is here that the daily habits of medieval hygiene begin to look genuinely different from anything Agnes or her grandmother would have recognized. A shift toward dryness, toward linen, toward an entirely new relationship between the human body and the water it had once trusted so completely. What people reached for instead, in the absence of the bathhouse and the basin they had always relied on, would come to define an entire era of daily life quietly, patiently, one household at a time. Somewhere in the decades following the worst of the plague years, a new idea takes hold across households throughout Europe, one so different from the bathing culture that came before it that it deserves to be understood on its own terms, rather than simply dismissed as an absence of the water and steam that had once defined daily hygiene. This new idea holds that clean linen worn directly against the skin and changed frequently can accomplish nearly everything a bath once did, drawing sweat and dirt away from the body through the simple repeated contact of fresh cloth against bare skin. Historians studying this period sometimes call it the linen theory of cleanliness, and it would go on to dominate European ideas about hygiene for the next several centuries long after the specific fear of plague that first gave it such urgency had itself faded into distant memory. Physicians writing in the generations after the worst plague years increasingly framed linen not as a poor substitute for bathing, but as a genuinely superior method, one that achieved the desired cleanliness without ever exposing the body to the dangerous warmth and moisture that had grown so thoroughly associated with sickness and death. The daily practice built around this idea looked, in its own particular way, genuinely thoughtful rather than careless. A person waking in the morning would typically wash only the parts of the body left visibly exposed, the face, the neck, the hands, using a small basin of water and perhaps a scrap of linen cloth, much as households had always done, even at the height of the bathing culture. The rest of the body, though, was now cared for primarily through friction and fabric rather than water. A vigorous rubbing with a dry linen cloth, sometimes performed by a servant for those wealthy enough to employ one, was believed to draw impurities up through the pores and away from the body, entirely working the skin briskly enough to produce a genuine flush of warmth without ever introducing the water that physicians had spent a full generation warning against. This friction-based approach carried its own quiet logic within the medical framework of the time. Since a body rubbed this vigorously did, in fact, warm slightly and flush with visible colour, a physical response that period observers took as clear evidence. The method was genuinely working, drawing corruption up and out of the body through entirely dry, entirely safe means. A fresh linen shirt or chemise worn beneath whatever outer clothing the season and occasion required, absorbed whatever the rubbing left behind and was changed in wealthier households every single day. Sometimes more than once the soiled linen sent to be laundered in cauldrons of boiling water and lye soap that the fabric itself, unlike human skin, could safely tolerate. Here is where a genuinely surprising detail enters the story, one that tends to reshape how people think about this entire era once they hear it clearly explained. The amount of linen a household owned and the frequency with which its members changed into fresh shirts became one of the single clearest markers of wealth and status across late medieval and early modern Europe, arguably more visible and more socially meaningful than jewellery, or even the cut of one's outer clothing. A nobleman's inventory from this period might list dozens of linen shirts, carefully counted and valued individually, while a labouring family might own only 2 or 3, worn in careful rotation while the others were washed, dried and pressed. Laundresses became genuinely essential figures within any prosperous household of this era, their labour quietly underwriting the entire visible performance of cleanliness that linen had come to represent: hauling water, scrubbing fabric against washboards or flat stones, and hanging heavy wet linen to dry across whatever open ground a household could access, a task considerably more physically demanding in its own way than the water hauling that had once supported the older bathing culture. Large households in cities often sent their linen out to professional laundresses, working along riverbanks in dedicated washing districts, entire stretches of town given over to this single, glamorous but absolutely essential trade, the rhythmic slap of wet fabric against stone, a constant familiar sound in these particular neighbourhoods throughout the working day. Cleanliness, in other words, had not disappeared from medieval and early modern life at all. It had simply relocated from the water a person bathed into the fabric a person wore, and the visible whiteness of a fresh linen collar or cuff peeking out from beneath outer clothing became a small, walking advertisement of exactly how clean and exactly how prosperous its wearer actually was. None of this meant that unpleasant realities simply vanished from daily life, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Lice remained a genuinely common companion of medieval and early modern life, clinging to hair, clothing and bedding, regardless of how carefully a household managed its linen and the fine-toothed bone, or wooden combs used to remove them. The very same kind Agnes once used by firelight at the start of this story remained an essential tool in nearly every household across every social class. Even the wealthiest households with their dozens of linen shirts and their carefully perfumed gloves were not exempt, since lice travelled easily through shared beds, shared clothing storage, and the close physical proximity that defined nearly all domestic life in this period, regardless of how much a family could afford to spend keeping the rest of their appearance immaculate. Skin conditions that a modern doctor could treat easily with basic medication, minor rashes, persistent itching, small infections that never quite healed properly, were simply an accepted, unremarkable part of ordinary existence for most people, tolerated with the same quiet resignation people applied to bad weather or a difficult harvest, since there was, for most of these conditions, genuinely little else to be done about them, given the medical knowledge available at the time. Household remedy books from the period offer a genuinely striking window into this reality, filled with recipes, combining herbs, animal fat and occasionally more unusual ingredients intended to soothe an itch or calm an inflamed patch of skin, rather than to cure the underlying condition entirely, since a true cure, in the modern sense, simply was not within reach of the medical understanding available at the time, and smell inevitably became a more constant presence in daily life than it had been during the height of the bathhouse era, though perhaps not to the extreme degree that later popular imagination would eventually exaggerate it into. People of this period were not simply oblivious to body odour, nor were they somehow biologically different from people today in what they found pleasant or unpleasant. They developed instead an entire elaborate culture around masking and managing scent through means other than washing the body directly. Wealthy households carried small perforated cases known as pomanders filled with fragrant substances such as ambergris musk or dried citrus peel, studded with cloves worn on a chain or tucked into clothing specifically to create a private personal cloud of pleasant scent throughout the day. The most elaborate pomanders were themselves genuine works of craftsmanship made from gold or silver and divided into separate small compartments, each one holding a different fragrance so that a wearer could select whichever scent suited their mood or the particular company they expected to keep that day, an object that functioned as both a practical tool and a small personal piece of jewelry. Sachets of dried lavender and rosemary were tucked between folded linens in storage chests, so that clean clothing carried its own fragrance even before it touched the skin. Gloves, too, were frequently perfumed, a detail recorded in the account books of several wealthy households, since hands constantly exposed and constantly in use required particular attention that a rubbing cloth alone could not fully provide. Even simpler households without the means to purchase imported musk or ambergris relied on herbs grown in their own gardens, tucking sprigs of mint or rosemary into clothing or scattering fresh rushes mixed with dried herbs across the floor of a home, a modest but genuine version of the same underlying impulse that drove the far more elaborate perfuming habits of the wealthy. Scholars still debate exactly how consciously ordinary people understood the trade-off they were making during this period, whether the shift away from water genuinely felt at the time like a reasonable and considered response to a real medical danger, or whether it simply became habit-absorbed by successive generations who had never personally experienced the older bathing culture and therefore had nothing to directly compare their own daily practices against. The written evidence that survives tends to come disproportionately from wealthier literate households, the very people with the most linen, the most perfume, and therefore the most resources to manage this new dry approach to cleanliness reasonably comfortably, leaving considerably less certainty about how the poorest households with only a shirt or two to their name and no coin to spare for imported musk actually experienced these same centuries of caution around water. What little evidence does survive from poorer households, mostly indirect, drawn from parish records, court records concerning theft of clothing, and the occasional surviving inventory from a modest estate, suggests real hardship in maintaining even the reduced version of cleanliness that linen theory demanded. Since a family that could not afford enough spare shirts to rotate through washing had far fewer good options available to them than a household with dozens of shirts folded neatly in a chest. What almost never disappeared even during the driest, most water-averse decades of this era was the specific ritual of washing hands before eating. Medieval and early modern courtesy books, guides written specifically to teach proper behavior at table and in company return to this particular instruction again and again, with a consistency that suggests just how deeply ingrained it remained, even as broader bathing habits shifted dramatically around it. Diners were expected to wash their hands immediately before sitting down to a meal, often from a basin and ewer brought directly to the table by a servant, since food was still commonly eaten with the fingers rather than individual forks, which would not become common across most of Europe for several more centuries. This particular basin and ewer, often among the more valuable and carefully decorated household objects a wealthy family owned, occupied a genuinely prominent position in dining rituals of the period, presented with real ceremony at the start of a meal, and again in more formal households between courses, a small but telling sign of just how much social weight this one specific act of washing continued to carry even in an era otherwise so cautious about water more broadly. A guest who sat down to eat with visibly unwashed hands was considered to have committed a genuine social offence, regardless of how the rest of that same person's body might have been cared for that particular week, a detail that reveals just how selectively, how deliberately medieval and early modern people applied their caution around water, reserving it for the specific moments and specific body parts where cleanliness mattered most visibly to the people around them. Is it fair then, looking back at this entire era from a comfortable distance of many centuries, to call it simply filthy, simply careless, simply an age that had abandoned hygiene altogether? The honest answer sits somewhere far more complicated than either the old stereotype or a simple defensive correction of it. This was a genuinely brutal stretch of history in certain real respects, shaped by disease, by fear, by medical theories that we now know were mistaken in their fundamental understanding of how sickness actually travelled from one body to another. Real suffering, real discomfort, real chronic conditions accompanied ordinary daily life for people across every level of society. Conditions that most people listening to this story tonight would find genuinely difficult to imagine tolerating themselves. And yet within that same brutal reality, an entire, careful, considered, remarkably resourceful system of cleanliness continued operating, built from linen instead of water, from fragrance instead of steam, from a set of genuinely reasoned beliefs about the body that simply happened through no fault of the people holding them to be built on an incorrect understanding of how disease actually worked. There is something quietly moving in that fact. If you sit with it for a moment, the image of an entire continent of people, generation after generation, doing their genuine best with the knowledge available to them, caring for themselves and their families as thoughtfully as their circumstances allowed, never once suspecting that the very precaution they trusted most had nothing at all to do with the danger they were actually trying to protect themselves from. It is this same complicated, resourceful world that left behind the physical evidence historians and archaeologists still study today. The delousing combs pulled from riverbeds and burial sites, the linen fragments preserved in unusually dry conditions. The household inventory is carefully itemizing every shirt a family owned, each object a small silent witness to exactly how people in this period actually lived, far more precisely and far more honestly than any later legend or exaggeration ever could. And it is to that physical evidence patiently gathered and carefully interpreted over generations of careful scholarship that the story now turns its attention, letting the objects themselves, rather than the assumptions of a much later age, speak for the people who once relied on them. Dig beneath a medieval town today in the right conditions, and you will not find neatly labelled artefacts waiting in tidy rows. You will find soil layered and compressed by centuries of use. And within that soil, if the conditions happen to be right, an extraordinary amount of information waiting patiently to be read by people trained to read it. Archaeology in this particular corner of history works less like a treasure hunt and more like careful detective work performed on an almost microscopic scale. And some of its most revealing evidence about medieval hygiene comes not from grand artifacts at all, but from something far humbler and considerably less glamorous, the contents of medieval latrines. It is a strange thought, perhaps, that some of the most honest testimony an era can leave behind comes not from what its people chose to write down, but from what they simply threw away, breed or otherwise, never expected anyone to examine again. The specialized field devoted to this particular kind of evidence is called archaeoparasitology, and it involves the careful examination of ancient cesspit sediment for the preserved eggs of intestinal parasites, organisms so small they require a microscope to identify, yet durable enough in their eggshell casings to survive undisturbed in the right waterlogged, oxygen-poor soil for many centuries. Researchers examining medieval latrine deposits from cities such as Cambridge in England have found startlingly high rates of infection by parasites such as roundworm and whipworm intestinal organisms, typically spread through contact with contaminated soil or food, or through inadequate hand washing after using a latrine and before preparing or eating a meal. In one systematic study of skeletal and sediment samples drawn from medieval burial and latrine sites across the city, researchers found evidence suggesting that a genuinely substantial portion of the medieval population carried one or more of these parasites at any given time, a finding that sits in fascinating, complicated tension with everything the previous parts of this story have described about medieval attention to hand-washing and linen-based cleanliness. What makes this research particularly compelling is the comparative element built into several of these studies, examining not just medieval samples but earlier Roman-era deposits from the very same sites, allowing researchers to trace how infection rates actually shifted across many centuries within a single continuous location, rather than relying on scattered comparisons between entirely different towns with entirely different conditions. How do we make sense of that tension? It would be easy hearing this evidence in isolation to conclude that all the careful ritual around washing hands before meals, all the attention paid to fresh linen and careful grooming simply failed to accomplish anything meaningful. But the reality uncovered by this kind of research is considerably more nuanced than that. Intestinal parasites of this kind spread through a wide, tangled web of pathways, contaminated water used in cooking, unwashed vegetables grown in soil fertilized with human waste, close contact with domestic animals that carried their own related parasites, and communal living conditions that made truly thorough sanitation difficult to achieve consistently across an entire household, let alone an entire town, regardless of how sincerely individual people tried to follow the hygiene practices their culture valued. A family might wash their hands scrupulously before every single meal, and still, through no failure of discipline or care on their part, consume vegetables grown in a garden plot fertilized the previous season with waste that carried parasite eggs invisible to the naked eye, a single unavoidable link in an otherwise carefully maintained chain of household cleanliness. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how much of this parasitic burden could have been prevented by the sanitation knowledge available at the time, since medieval society, for all its genuine care around visible cleanliness, had no concept of microscopic organisms and therefore no way to specifically target the actual pathways these parasites used to spread from person to person. The latrines themselves, once excavated and studied, tell their own separate story about medieval sanitation engineering, one considerably more organized than popular imagination often assumes. Monasteries again provide some of the clearest evidence, since their large disciplined communities required genuinely functional waste management systems to operate at all. Excavated monastic latrine blocks, known in the specialized vocabulary of medieval architecture as reredotas, reveal carefully engineered stone channels designed to be flushed continuously by diverted stream water, carrying waste efficiently away from the living quarters and out beyond the monastery walls. A system requiring real understanding of gradient water flow and long-term structural planning to build successfully. These reredotas were often built directly adjoining the monk's dormitory, connected by a covered passage that allowed access at any hour, without exposure to the weather, a detail of thoughtful, practical design that speaks to just how seriously these communities took the ordinary comfort and dignity of their members, even in matters most later ages would consider far too mundane to mention in any surviving record. Some larger monastic complexes maintained separate, smaller latrine facilities specifically for the infirmary and for visiting guests, a further sign of just how deliberately these communities thought through the practical needs of different groups moving through their walls, rather than treating sanitation as an afterthought bolted onto a building already designed around worship and daily labor. Urban latrines, by contrast, tended to be simpler cesspits dug beneath or behind a house, and periodically emptied by workers whose entire trade consisted of this single unglamorous but genuinely essential civic service. Workers who in several English towns were known in one of the more memorable pieces of period vocabulary to survive into modern historical writing as gong farmers, a term derived from an older word for a privy. This was skilled regulated labour rather than casual unstructured work, with several towns issuing formal ordinances specifying when gong farmers could operate, since the work was understandably restricted to nighttime hours, and requiring the material they removed to be carted well beyond the town walls rather than simply dumped nearby. Evidence of at least a partial practical understanding that concentrated waste posed some kind of genuine health concern, even without any formal theory of germs to explain precisely why. Teeth, perhaps surprisingly, have become one of the single richest sources of evidence about medieval hygiene and daily life available to modern researchers. Dental calculus, the hardened plaque that accumulates on teeth over a lifetime, and that modern dentistry works hard to prevent, actually preserves remarkably well on medieval skeletal remains. And within that calculus, trapped and sealed for centuries, researchers regularly find microscopic particles of food pollen, and occasionally even tiny fragments of textile fiber, evidence in at least some cases of people using their teeth to help work or soften cloth, or perhaps holding thread between their teeth while sewing small unconscious habits captured entirely by accident within a substance nobody at the time ever imagined would be examined by scientists many centuries later. One particularly striking discovery made in the dental calculus of a medieval woman buried at a former monastic site in Germany revealed tiny particles of a rare and expensive blue pigment called lapis lazuli, evidence that led researchers to conclude she had likely worked as a scribe or illuminator, repeatedly touching a fine brush to her lips to shape its point while painting elaborate manuscript decorations, a conclusion that quietly overturned earlier assumptions that such skilled artistic work in monastic settings had been performed almost exclusively by men. Isotope analysis of the same teeth and of bone tissue elsewhere in the body can reveal detailed information about diet, and in some cases about where a person spent their childhood versus where they eventually died, since the chemical signature of local water and food becomes quietly recorded within growing bone and tooth structure, offering researchers a way to trace individual life histories with the level of precision that written medieval records, focused overwhelmingly on the wealthy and the literate, could never provide for an ordinary person. Combs, too, continue to surface in archaeological excavations across former medieval settlements, remarkably consistent in basic design across many centuries and many different regions, carved from bone antler or boxwood, with one row of coarser teeth for general grooming and a second, considerably finer row specifically intended for removing lice and their eggs from hair. Some surviving examples, preserved through fortunate burial conditions, still carry traces of the substances once used alongside them, and in at least one remarkable case from a well-preserved medieval site, researchers were able to identify the genetic material of actual head lice caught between the comb's teeth, offering an almost startlingly direct physical connection to a specific individual moment of grooming, performed by a specific individual person many centuries ago. A level of intimacy with the deep past that few other kinds of archaeological evidence can offer quite so directly. Researchers working in this particular niche of genetic archaeology have gone further still, using preserved lice remains recovered from various historical sites across many centuries to reconstruct something like a family tree for the lice themselves, tracing genetic lineages that, because lice depend so completely on close human contact to spread from one host to another, effectively mirror patterns of human migration and contact across the very same span of centuries, an unexpected and genuinely elegant way of using one of history's least glamorous companions to illuminate the movement of the people who carried them. Textiles themselves survive far less often than bone comb or parasite egg, since organic fibre decomposes readily in most soil conditions. But in certain remarkable circumstances, waterlogged, oxygen-poor sites have preserved genuine fragments of medieval linen and wool clothing, offering researchers rare direct physical confirmation of the written accounts describing shirts, chemises, and household linen that this story has already discussed at length. Excavations along the banks of rivers in cities such as London, where centuries of discarded material sank into thick, oxygen-starved mud, have yielded a surprising quantity of preserved medieval textile fragments examined today in careful conservation laboratories using techniques the original wearers of that same cloth could never have imagined existing, including microscopic fibre analysis capable of distinguishing the specific type of flax or wool used, and in some cases even identifying the particular weaving technique employed by a craftsperson working many centuries ago. Cold, dry conditions can preserve textiles just as effectively as waterlogged mud, and Norse settlements in Greenland dating from roughly the same broad period this story has been covering have yielded an extraordinary collection of well-preserved medieval clothing from graves protected by the region's naturally cold, arid soil, giving researchers an unusually complete picture of how ordinary garments were actually cut, sewn and worn, details that written sources from the period focused far more on describing wealth and status than on recording the practical construction of everyday clothing rarely bother to mention at all. Scholars still debate exactly how representative these surviving fragments actually are of typical medieval clothing more broadly, since the specific conditions required for this kind of preservation were relatively rare, and wealthier households whose belongings were more likely to end up in the kind of substantial, well-built structures that create these preservation conditions in the first place may be somewhat overrepresented in what has actually survived for us to study. What emerges from all of this careful, patient, often quite unglamorous research is a picture considerably more textured than either the old stereotype of medieval filth or a simple defensive correction, insisting the era was actually perfectly clean by its own standards. The physical evidence shows genuine effort, genuine engineering, genuine cultural investment in cleanliness. Exactly where written sources have already told us to expect it in monastic plumbing and carefully maintained combs, in linen fragments preserved by chance, and it shows simultaneously genuine limitation, genuine ongoing struggle with the invisible microbial world that no amount of visible cleanliness, however, sincerely pursued could fully address, given the medical knowledge available at the time. Both of these things are true at once, and neither one cancels out the other. A reminder that the honest history of any era rarely resolves itself into the simple, single-note story that popular imagination usually prefers. A gong farmer working carefully within regulated hours, a monk maintaining an elaborate flushing latrine, a mother combing lice from her daughter's hair by firelight, and a soil sample revealing centuries-old parasite eggs are not contradictory pieces of evidence pointing in opposite directions. They are simply different facets of the same complicated, genuinely human reality, each one true, each one incomplete on its own, each one requiring the others to form anything resembling a full picture. There is something worth sitting with in this particular kind of evidence recovered not from the grand pronouncements of kings or the careful arguments of physicians, but from the discarded, the buried, the accidentally preserved. A comb dropped and lost centuries ago speaks with a different, quieter authority than any royal account book or medical treatise ever could, because it carries no agenda, no attempt to persuade or impress, only the plain, physical fact of its own existence and use. The same is true of a fragment of linen pulled from centuries of river mud, or a single parasite egg preserved in a cesspit sediment sample. Each one a small, honest witness that never once considered how it might eventually be judged by people living in an entirely different world many hundreds of years later, It is this same quiet physical authority that the story turns to next, moving from what the ground itself remembers into the more considered, more actively debated territory of how historians today argue over what all of this evidence taken together actually means for how we should understand an entire era. Historians, it turns out, argue about hygiene with just as much passion as they argue about wars, kings, and revolutions, and the argument surrounding medieval cleanliness has been running in one form or another for a genuinely surprising number of centuries. To understand where the popular image of a filthy, unwashed Middle Ages actually came from, we have to look somewhat counterintuitively not at the medieval period itself, but at the people who came afterward and had their own particular reasons for wanting that period to look as backward as possible. It is a pattern that repeats throughout the history of how one era chooses to remember another, and once you notice it operating here, it becomes considerably harder to take any single confident, unexamined claim about the deep past entirely at face value. The seeds of this reputation were planted remarkably early by the Italian scholar and poet Petrarch, writing in the 14th century itself, who coined the very idea of a dark age separating his own supposedly enlightened moment from the glories of ancient Rome. Petrarch was in fact describing the earlier medieval centuries rather than his own lifetime, but the framework he created, a golden classical past, a degraded intervening darkness, and a hoped-for cultural rebirth, proved enormously appealing to later generations of scholars looking for a tidy narrative to organize the sprawling complexity of European history. Renaissance thinkers who followed Petrarch's lead had strong incentives to paint the centuries immediately preceding their own as crude and backward, since doing so made their own artistic and intellectual achievements look all the more remarkable. By comparison, a pattern of flattering self-comparison that would repeat itself in different forms for centuries to come. It is worth noting too that Petrarch himself lived and wrote well before the deepest, driest decades of bathhouse avoidance. This story is about to describe meaning the very writer who first popularized the notion of a dark, backward age preceding his own had no direct personal experience of the specific hygiene habits that later generations would come to blame most heavily on the period he was describing. A small irony that tends to get lost whenever this history is told too quickly. That pattern reached a genuinely decisive turning point during the 18th and 19th centuries as Enlightenment thinkers and later Victorian writers, increasingly proud of their own era's scientific and industrial progress, found the supposed backwardness of the medieval period enormously useful as a contrast against which to measure their own achievements. 19th century sanitation reformers in particular genuinely revolutionizing public health through new sewer systems, new understandings of disease transmission and new civic investment in clean water had every reason to frame their own moment as a triumphant break from centuries of ignorance and filth that came before them, and medieval Europe distant enough to feel safely foreign, yet familiar enough to serve as a recognizable reference point, became a convenient symbol for everything modern progress claimed to have overcome. This was not in most cases a matter of deliberate dishonesty on the part of these reformers who were generally responding to genuinely urgent public health crises unfolding in their own overcrowded, rapidly industrializing cities, but rather a natural human tendency to define one's own achievements against a simplified, flattened version of what came before a rhetorical habit that historians of science and medicine have observed repeating itself across many different eras and many different fields of human progress. Popular writers, historians, and eventually novelists absorbed and amplified this framing throughout the following century, and by the time popular culture in the 20th century began producing films, novels, and eventually video games set in a vaguely medieval world, the image of grimy peasants, filthy streets, and universal indifference to washing had become so deeply embedded in popular imagination that it felt less like a historical claim requiring evidence, and more like simple, obvious common knowledge. Here is where the story takes a genuinely surprising turn, one that tends to catch even fairly well-informed listeners off guard. If we are looking for the actual historical low point of European bathing culture, the era when public washing reached its genuine minimum and warm water became most persistently feared, that low point sits not in the medieval period at all, but considerably later in the 16th and 17th centuries, well into what most people would call the early modern era rather than the Middle Ages. The reason for this later, deeper decline traces back to a second great wave of disease fear, distinct from the plague but built on remarkably similar logic. Beginning in the final years of the 1400s, a new and terrifying illness began spreading rapidly across Europe, one we now understand as syphilis, a sexually transmitted infection that produced disfiguring, painful symptoms and carried in this era, before effective treatment existed, a genuinely frightening long-term prognosis. The outbreak is often traced to a French military campaign into Italy that reached Naples in the final years of that same century, after which the disease spread with startling speed along trade and military routes across the rest of the continent, acquiring in a detail that reveals just how thoroughly this newer epidemic echoed the earlier plague's pattern of blame and fear, different national names in different countries, with the French calling it the Neapolitan disease, and the Italians calling it the French disease, each population eager to attribute the new horror to their neighbours rather than to themselves. Physicians of the period, working once again from the best theoretical tools available to them, debated its origin extensively, some proposing it had arrived from the recently encountered Americas by way of returning sailors, a theory that remains genuinely contested among modern researchers studying ancient skeletal remains for signs of the disease, and others insisting it represented some new mutation of an older, already familiar affliction, a genuine scientific disagreement that in its own smaller way mirrors the very kind of uncertainty this story keeps returning to throughout its exploration of medieval and early modern medicine. Bathhouses, given their long tangled history of association with intimate mixed bathing that this story has already touched on in earlier parts, became an obvious immediate target of suspicion once this new disease began spreading. Physicians and civic authorities, reasoning through a framework not entirely unlike the poor theory that had shaped responses to the plague generations earlier, concluded that the warm, humid, intimate environment of the stews provided an ideal setting for this new contagion to pass between bathers, a conclusion that, unlike the earlier plague era, misunderstanding about pores and corrupted air actually contained a genuine kernel of accuracy, since close physical intimacy of exactly the kind bathhouses had sometimes quietly facilitated for centuries really could and sometimes did contribute to the spread of a sexually transmitted infection. In one especially well-documented case, the French crown moved directly against the bathhouses of its own capital during the 1500s, and civic authorities in cities across the German territories followed a broadly similar pattern within a generation or two of the initial outbreak, converting what had once been a proud centuries-old civic institution into something increasingly rare, increasingly suspect, and in many towns eventually forgotten altogether within living memory. After city moved to close its remaining public bathhouses in the decades following this outbreak, this time with a specific targeted justification considerably more medically coherent than the earlier plague era. Panic had been, even if the underlying scientific understanding of the disease itself remained just as incomplete and confused as it had been generations before. Scholars still debate exactly how large a role the syphilis outbreak played compared to the lingering decades-old caution left over from plague-era poor theory, since the two fears arrived in sequence rather than simultaneously, and their effects on bathhouse closures overlapped and reinforced one another in ways that surviving records do not always allow historians to cleanly separate. Some researchers argue the plague-era closures had already done most of the real damage to bathing culture by the time syphilis arrived, leaving the newer disease to simply finish off an institution already weakened by a full century of accumulated suspicion, while others point to surviving civic records showing bathhouses reopening and operating with reasonable normalcy, right up until the specific years when syphilis fears intensified, suggesting the newer disease deserves considerably more credit or perhaps blame for the institution's final, more permanent decline than the older plague-era caution alone could fully account for. What the documentary evidence does show with reasonable clarity is that bathhouse closures accelerated and became considerably more permanent during this later period than they had been in the immediate aftermath of the plague itself, when, as an earlier part of this story described, many bathhouses had continued reopening and closing intermittently for generations. By the middle of the 1500s, in cities across France, the German territories, and much of the rest of Western Europe, the public bathhouse, once so central to medieval town life that entire streets and neighborhoods had organized themselves around it, had become in most places a genuine rarity, rather than an ordinary civic institution. This creates a genuinely striking historical irony worth sitting with directly. The era most popularly blamed for filth and indifference to washing, the medieval period itself, actually maintained for much of its long span a richer, more organized, more socially celebrated bathing culture than the supposedly more advanced, more enlightened centuries that followed it. The Renaissance, an era popularly associated with art learning and cultural rebirth, was, by the specific measure of how frequently ordinary Europeans immersed themselves in warm water, in many respects considerably drier and more water-averse than the medieval centuries it has spent so many later years looking down upon. Consider the sheer strangeness of that fact for a moment. The same decades that produced some of the most celebrated painting, sculpture and architecture in European history, the same courts that funded artists whose names remain instantly recognizable many centuries later, existed within a broader culture that had, by nearly every measure this story has traced, grown considerably more cautious and more restrictive about the simple act of bathing than the supposedly cruder, more backward medieval world. Those same courts like to imagine themselves as having decisively surpassed. It is a genuinely useful reminder that historical progress rarely moves in one single, steady upward direction across every single domain of daily life simultaneously, and that a civilization capable of extraordinary advances in painting, architecture and philosophy can at the very same moment be moving backward in some other, less celebrated corner of ordinary human experience. Modern historians working to correct the older exaggerated stereotype of medieval filth have understandably focused considerable attention on recovering and highlighting exactly this kind of nuance, drawing on the archaeological and documentary evidence already discussed in the previous part of this story to argue for a considerably more organized, more sophisticated medieval hygiene culture than popular imagination has traditionally allowed. Several influential books published over the past few decades, written by historians specializing in the social history of the body and daily life, have played a genuine role in shifting scholarly and gradually popular understanding of this period, tracing the specific rise and fall of bathing customs with a level of documentary care that the older, more casually inherited stereotype never bothered to attempt. But this corrective effort carries its own genuine risk, one that careful historians working in this field are increasingly attentive to the risk of overcorrecting so thoroughly that the real hardships, the real limitations, the real suffering that did exist across this long span of centuries gets quietly minimized or explained away in the enthusiasm of setting an old record straight. A popular video or article eager to debunk the old myth can sometimes swing so far in the opposite direction that it leaves the impression medieval Europe was, in some meaningful sense, cleaner or healthier than the modern world acclaim. The archaeological evidence discussed earlier in this story, with its high rates of intestinal parasites and its genuine unresolved struggle with invisible disease, simply does not support. The honest, careful position, the one most respected current scholarship in this area, tends to settle on sites somewhere genuinely in between the two extremes, acknowledging both the real sophistication of medieval hygiene culture at its height and the real genuine hardship that disease, poverty, and limited medical understanding imposed on ordinary people throughout the period without collapsing either truth into the other for the sake of a cleaner, more satisfying narrative. Is one era simply cleaner than another in any way that can be measured fairly across such vastly different centuries, different technologies, and different understandings of the body itself? The question put that plainly may not have a single satisfying answer at all, and perhaps it was never quite the right question to begin with. What historians can measure with somewhat more confidence is not some abstract universal standard of cleanliness, but rather the specific, evolving relationship each era built between its people and the water, the fabric and the daily habits available to them. Relationships shaped as much by disease, by fear, by economics, and by pure historical accident as by any steady linear march of human progress towards some imagined, ever-improving standard of hygiene. Each generation, in other words, was simply doing its own honest best with the specific tools, the specific fears, and the specific knowledge it happened to inherit, and judging any one of them against a standard they had no way of knowing or reaching says considerably more about the judge than about the judged. What remains true, regardless of exactly where historians eventually settle this particular scholarly argument, is that the centuries this story has traced from Agnes kneeling by her hearth through the height of the medieval bathhouse, through plague, through fear, through linen and fragrance, and careful, resourceful adaptation, left consequences that rippled forward through the population in ways considerably more concrete and considerably more measurable than any single historian's interpretation of the evidence. Disease patterns shifted, mortality shifted, the basic texture of daily human comfort shifted generation after generation in ways that the people living through any single decade of this long unfolding story could never have fully appreciated from where they stood. A person born into the driest, most water-averse decades of the 16th century inherited a body, a set of daily habits, and a set of chronic, low-grade health struggles considerably different from what their own great-grandparents bathing freely in the crowded, steaming warmth of a 13th century stew would ever have recognized as normal, even though both were in every meaningful sense living through the same broad, continuous story of a civilization trying generation after generation to care for its own bodies as best it knew how. It is to those concrete human consequences, the actual cost, actual measurable in bodies and lifespans and daily suffering, that the story now has to turn. Every choice a society makes about how to care for its bodies eventually shows up somewhere concrete in a birth record, in a skeleton pulled carefully from consecrated ground in the average number of years a person could reasonably expect to live before their community buried them. This part of the story turns toward those concrete traces, the measurable human cost of everything this narrative has described so far. Not to settle any old score against the medieval and early modern periods, but simply to understand as honestly as the surviving evidence allows what all of this actually meant for the people living through it. Numbers alone can feel cold, distant, easy to skim past without truly absorbing, but behind every statistic this part of the story touches sits an individual person, a specific mother, a specific child, a specific labourer, coming home exhausted at the end of an ordinary working day, each of them living a real, singular life that happened to unfold within the much larger currents this story has been tracing. Childhood, unsurprisingly, absorbed a disproportionate share of this cost. Infant and early childhood mortality across the medieval and early modern periods remained devastatingly high by any modern standard. And while the causes were genuinely varied, ranging from complications during birth itself to malnutrition, to a wide range of infectious diseases that had nothing directly to do with bathing habits, hygiene played its own quiet contributing role within a whole larger tangled picture. Swaddling, the common medieval and early modern practice of wrapping an infant tightly in long bands of cloth was believed at the time to help an infant's soft developing limbs grow straight and strong, and while modern medicine understands the actual physical benefits of swaddling quite differently, the practice, when the same bindings went too long between changes, could create warm, damp conditions against delicate infant skin that contributed to rashes, minor infections, and general discomfort, an unintended consequence of a practice adopted for entirely different, genuinely well-meaning reasons. Midwives and mothers of the period were far from ignorant on this particular point, and surviving household guidance and midwifery manuals do specifically instruct caregivers to unwrap and check an infant regularly, evidence that the potential problem was genuinely understood and actively managed within the limits of what a busy household, often caring for several children at once alongside a full workload of daily labour, could realistically sustain. Skin conditions more broadly touched people at every stage of life, and certain specific ailments appear again and again across surviving medical records and increasingly in skeletal and even mummified remains examined by modern researchers. Scabies caused by microscopic mites burrowing into the skin and producing intense, persistent itching spread easily within the close living conditions of a medieval household, whether wealthy or poor, since the mites responsible travelled readily through shared bedding and prolonged close contact regardless of how clean a family otherwise kept their linen. A condition called favus, a fungal infection of the scalp producing distinctive yellow, cup-shaped crusts, and in severe or prolonged cases, permanent hair loss, appears frequently enough in period medical texts and later skeletal evidence to suggest it was a genuinely common, if rarely discussed in polite company, feature of daily life across much of Europe for many centuries. Household remedy books of the period offer a genuinely touching window into how families coped with these persistent chronic conditions, recording specific herbal washes and ointments passed down through generations, refined through careful repeated trial by people who had no formal medical training, but a genuine accumulated practical wisdom about which plants seemed to bring real relief and which simply did not. Neither condition was on its own life-threatening in most cases, but both represent the kind of chronic low-grade physical discomfort that simply had to be tolerated generation after generation by people who had no real medical means of curing them outright. Occupation perhaps unsurprisingly shaped a person's specific hygiene-related risks just as powerfully as wealth did. And here the evidence tells a genuinely striking story. Certain medieval trades exposed workers to conditions considerably harsher than those faced by the general population, and tanners stand out as a particularly vivid example. The process of converting raw animal hide into usable leather required soaking the hides in a range of substances that by any modern standard would be considered genuinely hazardous, including lime and various acidic solutions. and in some traditional preparation methods, other organic matter used specifically for its chemical properties in softening and treating the hide. Tanners' workshops were understandably kept at the edge of town, both because of the overwhelming smell and because civic authorities working from the same corrupted air theories that shaped so much of this story's earlier medical thinking associated the trade with a genuine risk to public health. Dyers faced their own distinct set of occupational hazards working with substances such as woad and for the most vivid and expensive reds dried insects imported at considerable cost, their hands and forearms permanently stained by years of repeated contact with these same dyes, a mark of the trade so visually distinctive that it appears as a recognizable detail in period illustrations depicting dyers at work. Butchers and those working in slaughterhouses faced their own particular exposure handling blood and remains daily in conditions that, while regulated in most towns to keep the worst of the waste away from residential streets, still placed these workers in far closer, far more frequent contact with organic decay than the average townsperson ever experienced a hazard, reflected in the specific placement of slaughterhouse and butcher quarters at the edges of most medieval towns, deliberately separated from bakeries, wells, and residential streets by civic ordnance in city after city across the period. Skeletal remains identified as belonging to tanners through associated grave goods or burial locations show measurable signs of physical strain and chemical exposure considerably beyond what most other medieval trades produced. A sobering specific reminder that hygiene and health in this period were never a single, uniform experience shared equally across an entire population, but something that varied enormously depending on exactly what work a person's hands were required to do each day. And yet here is a detail that genuinely surprises people once they encounter it clearly. A detail that complicates any simple story of steady decline. Following the plague years, this narrative has already described in detail. For the people who survived the initial waves of plague, particularly those working the land, the decades immediately following the worst mortality actually brought in certain concrete measurable respects, an improvement in daily living conditions, rather than a continued decline. With so much of the population gone, labour became genuinely scarce, and surviving labourers found themselves with considerably more bargaining power than their parents or grandparents had ever enjoyed, commanding higher wages, better food, and in many documented cases simply more calories and more varied nutrition than had been available before the plague swept through. Surviving wage records from several English and continental estates show real sustained increases in labourers' pay throughout the decades following the worst outbreaks, a shift significant enough that some landowners faced with a workforce that could now genuinely negotiate its own terms for the first time in generations attempted to pass restrictive legislation freezing wages at older pre-plague levels, legislation that in most documented cases proved almost impossible to enforce against the simple, stubborn reality of a labour market that had fundamentally shifted in favour of the workers who remained. Skeletal evidence examined by modern researchers studying bone density and markers of childhood nutritional stress has found in several well-studied populations genuine improvement in these specific measures among people who survived into adulthood in the decades immediately following the worst plague years, compared to skeletal populations from the more crowded, more resource-strained decades that preceded the outbreak. Scholars still debate exactly how widely this particular improvement applied across different regions and different social classes, since the evidence comes disproportionately from certain well-excavated sites rather than a comprehensive survey of the entire continent. And since the same decades that brought improved nutrition to plague survivors also brought the specific hygiene anxieties this story has already traced in detail, meaning any single population living through this period experienced a genuinely mixed, complicated bundle of both improving and worsening circumstances simultaneously rather than a single clean trend in either direction. Some historians studying this period argue that the nutritional gains, while genuinely real and genuinely measurable in the skeletal record, applied unevenly across different regions of Europe, with areas that recovered their population numbers more quickly, seeing those gains erode within a generation or two, while other, more sparsely repopulated regions retained a meaningfully better standard of living for considerably longer, a regional patchwork that resists any single tidy continent-wide summary. It is a genuinely useful reminder that catastrophe and improvement are not always opposites, arriving in tidy sequence, one ending precisely where the other begins, but can instead exist, tangled together within the very same historical moment, the very same population, sometimes even within the very same individual life. A single person who might have genuinely eaten better in their 30s than their own parents had eaten at the very same age, while also living under a far heavier, more persistent cloud of disease anxiety than their parents had ever known. How then should we actually weigh all of this together? The improved nutrition against the heightened disease, fear. The reduced bathing against the genuinely sophisticated linen-based hygiene system that replaced it, the real chronic suffering against the real resourceful adaptation people managed within the limits of what they understood. There may be no single number, no single clean verdict capable of resolving that question fairly, and perhaps that is in itself one of the most honest conclusions this story can offer. Life expectancy figures calculated by historical demographers for this period, drawing on a combination of parish records, tax rolls, and skeletal population studies, generally suggest an average life expectancy at birth, considerably lower than modern figures often. Somewhere in the 30s, though, this particular number, so frequently repeated in popular accounts of the period, is itself somewhat misleading if taken at face value, since it is heavily weighted downward by the very high rates of infant and childhood mortality already discussed. A person who survived childhood and reached, say, their 20th year had in most studied populations a genuinely reasonable chance of living considerably longer, sometimes well into their 50s or 60s, a nuance that the single often quoted average life expectancy figure tends to obscure rather than clarify. This particular statistical distortion, a low headline numbers driven, mainly by tragic early losses rather than by uniformly short lives across the entire population, appears again and again throughout the study of historical demography. And it is worth remembering whenever a single average figure gets used, whether in this story or in any other account of the deep past, to summarize the lived experience of an entire genuinely varied population across many centuries. Class inevitably shaped nearly every one of these outcomes, layering additional advantage or additional hardship onto whatever baseline risk a person's era, region, and occupation already imposed on them. Wealthy households with their private tubs, their dozens of linen shirts, their access to trained physicians and imported medicines could soften many of these risks considerably, even if they could not eliminate them entirely, since disease in this period, whatever its actual mechanism, did not respect wealth quite as completely as a family's other advantages might have led them to hope. Even royal households, for all their resources, lost children to disease and infection with a frequency that would be almost unthinkable in a comparably wealthy household today. A sobering reminder that money could buy considerable comfort and considerable advantage in this period, but never anything close to the level of genuine biological protection modern medicine now offers as a matter of routine expectation. Several of the most powerful ruling families across medieval and early modern Europe lost multiple children in infancy or early childhood, despite access to the very best physicians, the cleanest available water, and every material comfort their considerable wealth could provide. A pattern documented extensively enough in surviving royal household records that historians studying the period no longer treat it as an unusual exception, but as a genuinely expected, if still deeply painful feature of even the most privileged medieval and early modern childhood. Poorer households working the land or labouring in a town's less glamorous trades faced every one of these same risks with considerably fewer resources to soften their impact. Fewer spare shirts to rotate through, washing, less reliable access to a physician's attention, and considerably less capacity to simply wait out a bad harvest or a hard winter without real immediate suffering. The gap between these two experiences, wealthy and poor living. Through the very same broad historical forces this story has traced, represents one of the most consistent, most measurable human costs running underneath the entire narrative. A gap that no amount of careful linen management or clever herbal remedy could ever fully close. There is something worth holding on to, though, moving through all of this difficult, genuinely measurable human cost, and it is simply this. The people living through these centuries were never passive victims of circumstances entirely beyond their control, waiting helplessly for disease and hardship to arrive. They built combs and remedy books and monastic plumbing systems. They negotiated wages after catastrophe, changed their linen, perfumed their gloves, and washed their hands with real, consistent ceremony before every meal. They adapted generation after generation with whatever knowledge and whatever resources their particular moment in this long story happened to provide them. And in doing so, they left behind not just bones and parasite eggs and combs, but something considerably more enduring, a whole accumulated inheritance of habits, assumptions, and hard-won practical wisdom that would eventually, slowly, imperfectly, shape the very different world their descendants would come to inherit many generations later. A mother teaching her daughter to check for lice by firelight, a laundress passing her particular technique for working stains out of linen, down to an apprentice, a physician's careful if ultimately mistaken theory about pores and corrupted air. Each one of these small, ordinary acts of transmission carried forward a piece of accumulated human effort that no single generation could have built entirely on its own. It's worth remembering, too, that none of the people living through any single decade of this long story could see the whole shape of it, the way this narrative has been able to lay it out across many parts and many centuries. Agnes, kneeling by her hearth at the very beginning of this story, had no way of knowing that a catastrophe still generations away would eventually close the bathhouses her grandmother had once enjoyed. A physician debating poor theory in a Paris lecture hall had no way of knowing that his careful, sincere reasoning could eventually be proven wrong by tools no one alive in his century could have imagined existing. Each person in their own moment was simply doing their genuine best with what they had, and it is only from this considerable distance, looking back across so many accumulated centuries at once, that the whole shape of the story becomes visible at all. It is to that inheritance, the surprising, sometimes barely visible threads, connecting this long, complicated history to the world we actually live in today, that the story now gently begins to turn. Words more than almost anything else carry the past forward into the present without most people ever noticing they are doing it. And the story of medieval and early modern hygiene has left behind a genuinely surprising number of these small hidden inheritances sitting quietly inside vocabulary that people use every single day without a second thought. How many words do we speak without ever pausing to wonder what buried history they might actually be carrying inside them? Consider the word toilet itself, a term that entered English from the French word toilette, which originally referred not to a room or a fixture at all, but to a small cloth. The very kind of linen cloth this story has already spent considerable time describing, used for washing and grooming the body. The word slowly expanded over the following centuries to cover the entire ritual of dressing and washing, then eventually narrowed again to refer specifically to the room and finally the fixture, most closely associated with that ritual today, a linguistic journey stretching directly back to Agnes and her scrap of linen cloth. Even though almost nobody using the word now has any conscious awareness of that connection, other words carry their own quieter histories. Shampoo entered English considerably later during the period of British colonial contact with India, borrowed from a Hindi word originally referring to a vigorous massage rather than specifically to hair washing its meaning, gradually narrowing and shifting as it moved between cultures and centuries until it settled into the specific meaning familiar today. The word spa, now used generically for any wellness or bathing establishment, actually derives from a specific town in what is now Belgium renowned, since the medieval period, for its mineral springs. Exactly the kind of medicinal water tourism this story described earlier when tracing the height of bathing culture across medieval Europe. Even the word sauna, so thoroughly associated with modern wellness culture, traces back to a Finnish tradition of communal steam bathing that developed largely independently of the continental European story. This narrative has been following, yet arrived at a strikingly similar solution: hot stone steam and shared communal space to many of the same basic human needs medieval Europeans were solving through their own stews and bathhouses many centuries earlier. Even the humble word soap itself carries a long, tangled linguistic history, tracing back through several ancient languages to a root that may originally have referred to a reddish hair dye used by early Germanic peoples, a reminder that the words attached to our most ordinary daily habits often began their lives describing something quite different from their eventual settled modern meaning, drifting slowly across centuries and cultures the same way the actual practices of washing and grooming drifted and changed alongside them. The actual return of enthusiastic public bathing to European culture after the long, cautious centuries this story has traced in such detail arrived slowly, unevenly, and for reasons that would have felt entirely foreign to the people who once filled the medieval stews with steam and conversation. Beginning in the 1700s and accelerating considerably through the 1800s, a new medical and social fashion for what contemporaries called taking the waters swept across fashionable European society, driving a genuine revival of interest in mineral spring towns such as Bath in England, the very same site this story described earlier as having drawn both Roman and medieval visitors seeking relief from various ailments. Physicians of this later period, working from an evolving but still developing understanding of the human body, began recommending immersion in cold or mineral-rich water for a wide range of conditions, and wealthy society increasingly treated a visit to a fashionable spa town less as urgent medical necessity and more as a genuinely pleasurable social season, complete with dances, concerts, and elaborate social calendars built around the daily ritual of bathing, a strange, distant echo of the very same blend of medicine and pleasure that had once defined the height of medieval bathhouse culture many centuries earlier. The city of Bath itself underwent a remarkable architectural transformation during this particular revival, its narrow medieval streets gradually surrounded and eventually overshadowed by grand, sweeping crescents of pale stone housing built specifically to accommodate the wealthy visitors now flocking to the same waters that had drawn Roman priests and medieval pilgrims many centuries before them. Layers of architecture from entirely different eras, all clustered around the very same warm, mineral-rich spring, bubbling patiently up from the same ground it always had. Sea bathing too emerged as a genuinely new fashion during this same broad period, distinct from the older tradition of mineral spring bathing, and driven by physicians who began recommending cold seawater immersion for its supposed bracing restorative effects on the nervous system. A theory considerably different from the older humoral framework this story has already traced at length, though built from a similarly sincere, if ultimately incomplete, understanding of how the human body actually worked. Coastal towns across England and eventually much of the rest of Europe transformed themselves around this new fashion. Building the elaborate wooden bathing machines, small-wheeled changing rooms rolled directly into the shallow water to preserve modesty that became such a recognizable feature of 18th and 19th century seaside life a genuinely curious invention that most people encountering it in old paintings and photographs today find almost bewilderingly unfamiliar, even though it represents in its own particular way simply another chapter in the very same long human story of negotiating comfort, modesty, and health around the act of entering water. Tendons known in a somewhat unfortunate piece of period vocabulary as dippers were sometimes employed at the more fashionable seaside resorts specifically to physically assist or occasionally firmly encourage a hesitant bather into the genuinely cold waters of the English Channel or the North Sea, a level of structured, almost ceremonial supervision around the simple act of swimming that feels from a modern vantage point almost as elaborate and rule-bound as anything the medieval stews themselves once required of their own visitors. A more direct echo of the medieval story arrived during the middle of the 1800s when a British diplomat and writer named David Urquhart, having encountered elaborate hammam bathing culture during his travels through the Ottoman Empire, returned home determined to reintroduce something like it to British life. Urquhart's advocacy helped spark a genuine fashion for what came to be called Turkish baths across Victorian Britain, elaborate public bathing establishments built specifically to recreate the steam heat and ritual structure of the hammam tradition. This story touched on earlier when discussing the possible Islamic influence on medieval European bathhouses. These establishments were often built with genuine architectural ambition, incorporating ornate tilework, horseshoe arches, and other design elements meant to evoke the Ottoman originals as faithfully as Victorian craftsmen could manage, and several of the grandest examples still stand today in British cities. Their elaborate facades now sometimes housing entirely unrelated businesses, their original purpose visible only to those who happen to know exactly what to look for in the architectural details above a shop front or beside a converted doorway. These Victorian Turkish baths spread rapidly through British cities during the second half of the 19th century, and for a genuinely fascinating stretch of decades, ordinary Victorian city dwellers could once again experience something remarkably close to the communal steam bathing their distant medieval ancestors would have recognized immediately. Even though the intervening centuries of fear closure and linen-based dry cleaning meant almost none of these Victorian bathers had any conscious sense of participating in the revival of a much older tradition, rather than the invention of an entirely new one. Underneath all of this social and fashionable revival sat a far more consequential shift, one that finally genuinely resolved the specific scientific confusion this story has traced across many centuries. Through the 1800s, researchers, including Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany, developed and confirmed what we now call germ theory, the correct scientific understanding that specific microorganisms invisible to the naked eye cause specific diseases, finally replacing the centuries-old framework of humours, corrupted air, and open pores that had shaped medical thinking about bathing since long before the plague. This story described in such detail. This shift did not happen instantly or without genuine resistance, and one of the more sobering episodes along the way involves a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis, working in a Vienna hospital during the 1840s, who observed that mothers attended by physicians moving directly from autopsy rooms to childbirth wards without washing their hands in between died of childbed fever at dramatically higher rates than mothers attended by midwives who had no such contact with the dead. Semmelweis instituted a strict policy requiring physicians under his supervision to wash their hands in a chlorinated lime solution before attending any birth. A genuinely simple intervention that produced an equally dramatic, immediate drop in maternal mortality within his own ward results any modern reader would recognize instantly as compelling rigorous evidence by the standards of careful observational medicine. Semmelweis's insistence on mandatory hand-washing dramatically reduced mortality in his own hospital ward, yet his findings were largely rejected and even ridiculed by much of the medical establishment of his own time, since he could offer no accepted theoretical explanation for why the simple act of washing hands would matter so much. Precisely the same kind of gap between observed effect and accepted theory that had shaped so much of the medical confusion this story has already traced across many earlier centuries. Scholars of medical history still debate exactly why Semmelweis's genuinely correct, genuinely life-saving observation met with such fierce resistance during his own lifetime. Some pointing to his own difficult, uncompromising personality and his failure to publish his findings in a form other. Physician found persuasive others, pointing to the simple, powerful inertia of an entrenched medical establishment deeply invested in its existing theoretical framework, and still others noting that his conclusions, however correct, arrived without the microscopic mechanistic explanation that later germ theory would eventually provide, leaving contemporary physicians with a puzzling correlation but no satisfying causal story to hang it on. There is a genuine quiet sorrow in this particular episode that sits somewhat apart from the broader arc of scientific progress. This part of the story has otherwise been tracing since Semmelweis himself, by most surviving accounts, grew increasingly frustrated and isolated in the face of his colleagues' rejection and died relatively young in circumstances his own biographers still discuss with considerable care well before the wider medical world finally fully vindicated the very insight he had fought so hard and so unsuccessfully within his own lifetime to establish. Whatever the precise mixture of reasons behind that resistance, it would take several more decades and the accumulated weight of Pasteur and Koch's more systematic, more mechanistically grounded research before hand-washing and cleanliness more broadly became firmly, permanently established as genuine medical necessity, rather than simply one theory among several competing, equally plausible alternatives. Once germ theory finally took firm hold across the medical and scientific establishment, the practical consequences for ordinary daily hygiene arrived with genuine speed, reshaping public health policy, civic infrastructure, and eventually simple household habit across the following decades. Municipal governments across Europe and North America invested heavily in modern sewer systems and clean water infrastructure throughout the final decades of the 1800s and into the 20th century, finally achieving through modern engineering and a correct underlying scientific theory, something like the systematic town-wide sanitation that medieval monastic communities had managed on a smaller scale many centuries earlier. Though built now on genuine understanding of the actual microscopic mechanism at work, rather than the sincere but mistaken theories that had guided so much of the story this narrative has traced. Public health campaigns of the late 19th and early 20th centuries worked hard to translate this new correct scientific understanding into simple, memorable daily habits that ordinary families could actually practice. And it is worth noticing that many of the specific instructions these campaigns promoted — wash your hands before eating, keep food away from waste, change into fresh clothing regularly — would have sounded entirely familiar if incompletely explained to a household living many centuries earlier, even if the underlying reason for each specific habit had finally correctly been identified for the very first time. The commercial soap industry, which had existed in various forms since the medieval guilds. This story described earlier expanded dramatically during the industrial era, mass production finally making regular affordable soap available to ordinary households across the full range of the social spectrum in a way that would have been genuinely unimaginable to a medieval peasant family, carefully rationing a single treasured bar for special occasions. It's worth pausing here to notice just how directly this entire arc connects back to Agnes kneeling by her fire at the very beginning of this story, working a bone comb through her hair and hoping to feel presentable for a market day suitor many centuries ago. the specific fears that shaped her world and the specific fears that shaped the many generations who followed her. The plague, the poor theory, the syphilis, outbreak, the long, cautious centuries of linen and fragrance in place of water were never simply superstition or ignorance in any dismissive sense. They were the genuine, careful, best available reasoning of real people working with real, if ultimately incomplete, scientific tools. Reasoning that took many more centuries, several entirely new epidemics, and eventually a handful of genuinely brilliant, occasionally unheeded researchers to finally fully correct. Is it fair to imagine Agnes herself? Could she somehow witness the full sweep of everything that followed her own ordinary morning? Recognizing something of her own careful, resourceful habits echoed all the way forward into a modern hospital ward, a Victorian steam room, or a simple household sink. Perhaps that particular thought asks too much of any single historical imagination, but there is something genuinely moving in considering it, regardless the long, unbroken thread of ordinary human care running from one century into the next, largely unnoticed by the very people carrying it forward. What survives today, walking through a modern spa, stepping into a Turkish bath revival in a major city, or simply washing your hands before a meal out of pure unconscious habit, carries within it an almost unbroken thread reaching back through every single part of this long, complicated story. Back through Victorian revival and medieval fear and Roman engineering, all the way to whatever distant half-remembered human impulse first led someone, many thousands of years before any of the events this story has described, to step into a warm spring and simply feel for a moment genuinely cared for. The particular shape of that impulse has changed dramatically across the centuries, sometimes trusting water completely, sometimes fearing it intensely, sometimes finding an entirely different, resourceful way to express the same underlying human need. But the impulse itself, the simple, quiet desire to feel clean, cared for, and safe inside one's own body appears never to have disappeared at all, only to have found generation after generation, whatever particular expression its own specific moment in history happened to allow. Museums across Europe today preserve fragments of this long story, quite deliberately excavated bathhouse foundations displayed carefully beneath modern city streets, medieval combs and Roman hypocaust tiles arranged side by side in glass cases, offering any visitor curious enough to look a genuine physical glimpse of just how long and how continuous this particular thread of human care actually runs. There is one more part of this story left to tell, a final, quieter turn back toward where everything began, and toward what all of this long, winding history ultimately has to say about the people living through it, and about all of us listening now, so many centuries later, still working out our own particular relationship with water, with warmth, and with the simple, enduring human wish to feel at ease inside our own skin. Every long story eventually has to come back to where it started, and this one began with a single small fire, a single basin of water, and a young woman named Agnes working a bone comb through her hair in the dark hours before dawn. It is worth returning to her now one final time, not because her particular story was ever recorded in any surviving document, but because everything, this long history as traced across so many centuries, lived in the end, inside thousands upon thousands of mornings exactly like hers, mornings that left almost no trace at all except the pattern they collectively formed. A pattern this story has spent many hours now trying carefully to reconstruct. She was never real in the strict documented sense. The earlier parts of this story tried so hard to honor, but everything about her, the comb, the firelight, the careful weighing of what a single morning's water could accomplish, was assembled from real evidence. Real habits, real lives, lived by real people whose individual names simply never survived the passage of so many centuries. In a sense, she stands in for every single one of them, A single face given, however imperfectly, to an entire vanished multitude who otherwise would have no face left to offer at all. What that pattern actually shows taken as a whole is a civilization in constant thoughtful negotiation with its own body. A negotiation shaped by geography and labour, by faith and fear, by genuine scientific reasoning that simply lacked the tools to see what it was actually reasoning about. Water rose to the centre of daily life during the height of the medieval bathhouse, then receded almost entirely in the face of plague, and later an entirely different epidemic replaced by linen, by fragrance, by a system of cleanliness, built from fabric and friction rather than steam and immersion. Neither choice water embraced or water feared was ever simply foolish or simply wise. Each was the most reasonable response available to working with the specific knowledge, the specific fears, and the specific resources their particular moment in history happened to hand them. Looking back across the full sweep of it now, from Roman engineering through medieval steam, through plague-driven caution, through Victorian revival, the whole story reads less like a single steady line of progress, and more like a long, patient conversation, each generation answering the fears and the knowledge it inherited from the one before, then quietly passing its own answer forward to whoever came next. No single generation in this entire story ever had the final word. Each one simply added its own careful sentence to a conversation that had already been running for many centuries before they arrived, and that would continue running for many centuries after they were gone. There is something in this pattern that reaches well beyond the specific question of medieval hygiene, something that touches nearly every large historical story this channel has ever told, and likely every large historical story it ever will. Civilizations rise toward genuine sophistication, build institutions their own people are rightly proud of, and then watch some of that sophistication crumble in the face of catastrophe. Nobody could have reasonably predicted or prevented the bathhouse. In this sense, joins a much longer, much broader pattern. This kind of storytelling keeps circling back to the fragility of even a society's most confident, most deeply established achievements when confronted with the threat that arrives faster and stranger than anyone's existing framework can absorb. Rome's great aqueduct, still standing in fragments across the European landscape today, testify to exactly the same pattern on a grander, older scale. Extraordinary engineering brought low, not by any single dramatic defeat, but by the slow compounding weight of political collapse, until an entire continent simply forgot for a time how to build what its own ancestors had once built with apparent ease. Stand beneath one of those surviving stone arches today, as countless visitors do every single year, and it is genuinely difficult not to feel the full weight of that particular irony. An entire civilization's confidence written in stone, outlasting by many centuries the very knowledge that had once made building it possible at all. And yet collapse in this story, as in so many others, was never the final word. What survived the fall of Rome's bathing culture was not the physical infrastructure, but something quieter, and in its own way considerably more resilient, the underlying human habit of caring for the body adapted and rebuilt generation after generation using whatever materials and whatever knowledge each new era happened to have on hand. That same resilience appears again after the plague, when linen and fragrance rose to fill the space water once occupied. It appears again after syphilis, when an already cautious culture grew more cautious still, and it appears again centuries later in Victorian steam rooms and seaside resorts, and finally in a scientifically grounded public health movement that for the first time in this entire long story actually understood the true mechanism behind the danger it was working so hard to prevent. Habits can be interrupted. Institutions can be closed, sometimes for good reason and sometimes for reasons that later evidence would prove mistaken. But the underlying human impulse driving those habits, the plain stubborn wish to feel clean, cared for, and safe inside one's own body, appears to survive almost anything history throws at it quietly, finding some new shape to occupy whenever its old shape becomes unavailable. It survived plague, it survived fear, it survived being wrong for centuries about the very thing it was trying so hard to protect against, and it kept going anyway because the need underneath it was never actually about being right. It was about caring for oneself and for the people nearby, using whatever tools a given century happened to place within reach. Even the kings and physicians who shaped so much of this story's larger events were underneath their titles and their theories, simply people carrying that same basic need forward in whatever way their particular position allowed them, to no more and no less human than the peasant family, whose entire visible legacy amounts to a single line in a single surviving inventory. This story has also, throughout its many parts, tried to hold two things true at the same time without letting either one erase the other. The medieval and early modern periods were genuinely measurably harder on the human body than the world. Most listeners tonight will return to tomorrow morning. Harder in ways, this story has not shied away from describing honestly the parasites, the chronic skin conditions, the plague itself, the staggering rates of infant and childhood loss that shaped nearly every family living through these centuries. And at the very same time, these were not centuries of simple ignorance or indifference. They were centuries of genuine, careful, remarkably resourceful effort, visible in monastic plumbing systems, in carefully regulated bathhouses, in household remedy books passed lovingly from mother to daughter in the quiet, consistent ritual of washing one's hands before every single meal, regardless of what else that particular era happened to fear about water. Brutal and resourceful, frightened and genuinely wise within the limits of what they knew, these two descriptions were never actually in competition with each other. They describe the very same people living the very same lives, doing their very best with what history had given them to work with. It would be easy and considerably less honest to tell this story as either pure tragedy or pure triumph, but the truth this narrative has tried to hold on to throughout every single part is that most real history examined closely enough refuses to sit still inside either of those two simpler, more comfortable categories. This perhaps is the closest thing to a single lesson. A story this long and this varied can honestly offer that the people of the past deserve neither our pity nor our condescension, but something closer to plain, clear-eyed respect, the same respect we might hope some distant, unimaginable future audience extends to years, centuries from now. Listening to their own version of this exact same kind of story told about our own particular fears, our own particular resourcefulness, and our own particular imperfect best. Power to, this story has shown again and again offered considerably less protection than the people holding it might have hoped. Kings commissioned reports, physicians theorized with genuine confidence, church councils issued careful warnings, and disease moved through royal nurseries with almost exactly the same indifference it showed toward a farmer's cottage. This is perhaps one of the oldest and most durable lessons any long historical story eventually arrives at, whatever channel happens to be telling it, whatever century happens to be its subject. Authority can organize a society's response to hardship, can fund the physicians, and issue the ordinances and close the bathhouses when the evidence, however mistaken, seemed to demand it. But authority alone could never simply purchase its way out of the same basic biological vulnerability every single person in this story shared, from the wealthiest court to the humblest cottage, a vulnerability that made the wealthy and the poor in the end considerably more alike than either group likely wanted to admit at the time. A queen mourning a lost child and a labourer's wife mourning a lost child were in the end mourning through the very same helplessness, the very same absence of any real medical tool capable of saving what disease had already claimed. regardless of how differently their surrounding circumstances might otherwise have looked to an outside observer. There is one more thread worth naming before this story lets itself go quiet, and it concerns memory itself, the strange, uneven way any civilization chooses to remember its own past. This story spent real time several parts ago tracing how later centuries built an entire myth of medieval filth, largely to flatter their own sense of progress. A reminder that memory is never simply a neutral record of what happened, but something actively shaped generation after generation by whatever story the people doing the remembering most need to tell about themselves. The same forgetting and misremembering that turned an entire bathing culture into a punchline also very nearly erased the genuine sophistication, the genuine care. This story has spent so many hours now trying to recover and set back in its proper place. Memory, in other words, is its own kind of fragile institution, just as capable of collapse and slow rebuilding as any aqueduct or bathhouse, and every honest act of historical storytelling. This one included is really just one small, careful attempt at that same patient, ongoing work of rebuilding. If there is a single detail that seems to hold all of this together, it comes not from a king's account book or a physician's treatise, but from something considerably smaller and considerably more ordinary. A household inventory drawn up as countless similar documents were across these centuries at the death of an unremarkable rural household somewhere in 14th century England. Among the modest possessions listed alongside a few pots, a spinning wheel, and a handful of farming tools, sits a simple entry recorded in the flat, unremarkable Latin such documents typically use for 2 linen shirts and a wash basin. Nothing else about this household survives. We do not know these people's names. We do not know whether they lived through plague or famine, or simply the ordinary hardships of an ordinary life. We know only that when a clerk walked through their home and made an inventory of everything they owned, a basin for washing and 2 shirts to keep clean sat among the handful of possessions worth writing down at all alongside the tools that kept them fed and the wheel that kept them clothed. Whoever they were, cleanliness mattered enough to them in the middle of everything else pressing on an ordinary medieval life that it earned its own small permanent line in the only record that would ever survive to speak for them at all. It is a strange thing to feel something close to tenderness toward a line in a centuries-old legal document written by a clerk who almost certainly gave it no particular thought at all, simply doing his job listing what remained of a life already ended by the time he arrived to count it. And yet there it sits, this small, unremarkable proof that somebody in some ordinary household on some ordinary morning, many hundreds of years ago, cared enough about staying clean to own the tools for it, and to have those tools noticed, however briefly, by the world around them. That is in the end what this entire long story has really been about. Not kings, though kings appeared along the way. Not plagues, though plague shaped nearly everything this story eventually became. It has been about ordinary people, largely unnamed, largely unrecorded, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of caring for themselves and each other, within whatever circumstances history happened to place them in across many centuries through prosperity and catastrophe alike, leaving behind combs and basins and linen fragments as the only proof that they were ever here at all, doing their genuine best the way people always have. Kings and physicians and church councils shaped the larger forces. This story has traced the closures and the theories and the shifting fashions, but it was always these same ordinary unnamed people who actually lived inside those forces, absorbing each new fear, each new hardship, each new piece of guidance, and quietly working out, morning after morning, exactly how to keep themselves and their families as clean, as healthy, and as cared for as their particular moment in history would allow. That work never once stopped through plague, through fear, through centuries of mistaken theory, And it has not stopped now tonight in whatever quiet corner of the world you happen to be listening from as this story finally draws itself to a close. It is in its own small way still happening in your own home tonight, in the last few ordinary habits of the day before sleep finally gently takes hold. The night is getting late now, and it feels right to let the pace of this story slow the way the evening itself has been slowing around you. Think for a moment of that single wash basin, sitting quietly in a modest home centuries ago, waiting by a fire that has long since gone cold. History moved through that basin without it ever knowing. Plague came and went, kings rose and fell, whole cities forgot how to bathe and slowly carefully remembered again. Empires rose around it too in their own way. Rose and later fell, the basin never noticed either. Wars were fought many miles away. Treaties were signed. None of it reached the small stone room where the basin sat patient ordinary waiting for morning. And still each morning someone filled it with water, warmed by whatever fire they could manage, enough to wash a face, enough to feel for a moment cared for. That is the part of this story that never really changed. Not the water, not the fear of water, not even the reasons people gave for either one. Just the simple patient act of tending to one's own body and to the people sleeping nearby in whatever way a particular moment in time allowed. A small act repeated without fail across more centuries than any single mind can properly hold at once. Agnes did it by firelight before a market demi that history never recorded the outcome of. A monk did it in a stone washroom built to outlast him by many hundreds of years. A frightened mother did it in the terrible years after the plague, uncertain whether even this much water was truly safe. A Victorian bather did it in a steam room built to recall a world that had been gone for centuries. Somewhere a clerk once wrote 2 words into a ledger, wash basin, nothing more. And somehow that was enough to last. Enough to reach all the way to tonight. Enough to reach you lying quietly wherever you are hearing this story so many centuries later. And somewhere tonight, in your own home, in your own particular corner of a much longer story than any single life can hold, you did it too in your own way, without ever needing to think about all the centuries standing quietly behind that simple, ordinary act. You were never really alone in it. None of us ever are. The fire burns down slowly now the way it always has. The water cools in its basin. The house grows quiet around it. Somewhere far away a bell that used to mark the hour has long since gone silent. The comb rests on its shelf. The linen waits folded for morning. Outside the world keeps turning the way it always has, indifferent and patient and somehow still kind. The basin is empty now. The fire has gone out. The house is still. And somewhere just outside the reach of memory, someone is filling it again.